Please take your seats. This session must start now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We start working session 1, titled Fundamental Freedoms 1, including freedom of expression, free media and information. My name is Andrei Richter. I'm senior advisor to the representative on freedom of the media of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I will be moderator of this session. Before I give the floor to introducer, some words. For some words, the representative would like to take the floor.
Thank you, Andre, dear Ingeborg, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm delighted to be here today in Warsaw for this 2019 Human Dimension Implementation meeting, and wanted just to provide a brief introduction and overview of the main freedom of expression sessions that we will have during this week. Because usually the first session on freedom of expression is the one, on freedom of the media is the one where I provide my overview of the media freedom situation. But now we have a little bit of a different order of agenda, so I just wanted it to be clear. As you know, we will now hear from Mrs. Amy Brouillette, Research Director at Ranking Digital Rights, to discuss internet freedom and digital rights. And I really want to thank you, Amy, for coming from the US and for being our keynote speaker on this topic. And we look forward to listening to you. You are really a great expert on this issue, and your organization is doing a very fascinating and innovating work on these matters. Following these sessions, tomorrow morning at 10, during session 2, I will present my review of the current media freedom situation and development across the OSCE region. So I say this because I know that usually during the first session on media freedom, there's a lot of delegations or civil society organizations who wants to take the floor on the general situation in the region. But this session, this afternoon, is more dedicated to internet freedom. The one session where we will discuss more general issues is the one tomorrow morning. Then, on Wednesday, during session 4, on safety of journalists, at 10, we will hear from Tarlak McGonigal, a professor of media law and information society from Leiden University, who will address the issue of safety of journalists, in particular, their physical safety. And I'm pleased to see a session devoted entirely to this topic, one of the top priorities of my office. And it is especially welcome given the landmark Ministerial Council decision on safety of journalists, which was adopted last December and which will also be discussed in more details during this session. Then Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., the working session 5 will be presented by Nanny Jensen-Reventlow, Director of the Digital Freedom Fund, to discuss the legal safety of journalists, which is also part of the ministerial decision. And with so many journalists in prison across the OSCE region, I mentioned this morning, it is imperative that we address this issue and many other legal issues, such as the blocking of websites, closure of newspapers, surveillance, forced disclosure of confidential sources, and all the legal environment for the work of the media. And we also will have a lot of side events organized by my office or by others in which we will take part, which will touch upon these issues. Exactly 6 side events between tomorrow morning and Thursday morning. And I want just to mention the thematics. Tuesday, evening at 6:15, there will be a side events on Turkey situation of journalists, which is co-organized with Article 19, with several Turkish journalists and lawyers and NGOs representative. It will be moderated by Sarah Clark, and they just, for most of them, Sarah, returned from a fact-finding mission in Turkey. Wednesday at lunchtime, which is, as you know, one of the slots for side event at 1:15, we will have a side event on the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression, which we organize, where we will present again with Amy Brouillette and some others a project that we will be launching tomorrow. Wednesday evening at 6:30, we organize a special side event, which is in fact a screening of the documentary A Dark Place on the safety of female journalists online. And this will be co-hosted with the Polish Commissioner for Human Rights, the Ombudsman, and we will organize it in town at Human Rights Commissioner Conference Room. Thursday morning at 8:15, we will have a side event on media freedom and tolerance and non-discrimination that we organize together with ODIHR. And so this will be here in meeting room 2. And we also take part to 2 other side events which are relevant for us and for our concern on media freedom. One is Tuesday at lunchtime on building resilience to overcome vulnerabilities generated by the misuse of information in democratic society. So it's on disinformation, especially co-organized by Finland and Romania, together with us and ODIHR. And we will also take part to a side event Wednesday morning at 8:15, organized with the group of friends on safety of journalists, on how to build digital safety for journalism, best practices, and next steps. So that's a very heavy program. I'm delighted that we have so many time which is dedicated to discussion on these issues of media freedom, freedom of expression, safety of journalists, digital rights. So we have plenty of time for all the intervention, for real discussion between civil society, experts, and the representative of the participating states. And I want again to thank Andre for moderating this session and some others you will see. And of course, Mrs. Amy Brouillette for being our first speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arlem, for the overview. So we begin the session, and as a moderator, I should say that the list for speakers is still open, but I wouldn't encourage you to give more names because we really don't have much time, and we have 4 sessions ahead that are more or less related to the topic. So without any more elaboration about the speaking list, I will touch upon it maybe after the introduction by Amy Brouillette. I will say a few words about her and about her work. This office collaborates with Amy Brouillette for quite a while. We know her for several years. She was for many years a great expert at the Central European University in Budapest. Currently, she speaks as research director of Ranking Digital Rights. Ranking Digital Rights is a project which sets very ambitious aim. I quote, the aim is create global standards for companies to respect the standards for telecommunications and to respect human rights in telecommunications. Ranking Digital Rights has main instrument, as you can see by the name, is to evaluate the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecom companies, their policies and practices that affect freedom of expression and privacy. As Arlem Désir expressed, this session is more about online freedom and internet freedom and relation of online and internet freedom to freedom of expression and freedom of the media. Therefore, we thought it is quite appropriate for me to speak and to set the tone for the initial discussions today on Monday. As I said, and as is clear from the speech by Harlem Désir. The discussion will continue tomorrow and on Wednesday as well. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to give some remarks about the challenges of digital rights and internet governance in the OSCE region. As Andre said, my name is Amy Brulette, and I direct the research for a project called Ranking Digital Rights. And that project produces what we call a corporate accountability index, which ranks some of the world's most powerful digital platforms and internet and telecommunications companies on how transparent they are about policies and practices affecting freedom of expression and privacy. The ranking uses a methodology that sets benchmarks for how companies can better respect those fundamental human rights. And these benchmarks are based on international human rights frameworks, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that framework states that just as governments have the obligation to respect and protect human rights, so too do companies. RDR, since our first launch in 2015, we've produced 4 indexes. And while we've seen some progress over those 4 years, our research has found that companies across the board failed to disclose enough about their policies and practices affecting freedom of expression and privacy. Companies tend to disclose more about policies affecting privacy than about those affecting freedom of expression. And in fact, this is the area where most of the companies perform the worst in our index. And this trend also mirrors the overall state of internet freedom, both in the OSCE region and globally. And while I understand that this conference, the focus is on the OSCE region, many of the trends and the challenges that we are seeing today with internet freedom are happening at the global level as well. So on the positive side, there's been a kind of growing consensus among policymakers, investors, and the public, and slowly among tech companies about the importance of protecting privacy as a fundamental human right. There's been a wave of new data protection regulations that came into force around the world, as everyone knows, led mostly by the GDPR. And these regulations have put a much needed spotlight on the issue of data privacy and have strengthened the legal and regulatory safeguards protecting fundamental privacy rights, both inside and outside the EU. And while there's still a long way to go, both in terms of the regulations and in terms of implementation, the GDPR and other data protection regulations are a big step forward in pushing companies in the right direction. However, key challenges remain as new technologies like algorithms, automated decision-making systems are posing new risks to online expression and privacy in unprecedented ways that we're still trying to understand. Daily headlines report the many ways in which the internet and digital technologies make us vulnerable to mass surveillance, unaccountable censorship, massive privacy violations, and other types of human rights abuses. Whereas the internet was once considered a platform for enabling freedom of expression, the issue now is how to protect people from expression, as digital platforms have become a powerful venue for disseminating hate speech, disinformation, and other types of toxic speech aimed at inciting violence and manipulating public opinion. So while there have been some positive, although incremental, advancements on the privacy side, the key challenge today is really around the freedom of expression issue and how governments, companies, and civil society collectively address this critical and very complex challenge of if and how to regulate or moderate content and information flows online, and of how to strike the balance between protecting the fundamental right to freedom of expression and information while also protecting individuals and groups from types of speech that violate other rights will ultimately determine what kind of internet we end up with, whether the internet is a platform that enables democracy and supports human rights, or whether it is something that can be used to undermine it. One of the most pressing issues that we see at Ranking Digital Rights and others working in this space have seen is the lack of transparency by digital platforms about how they curate, shape, or otherwise censor content online. Companies like Facebook, Google, and Twitter have had relatively unchecked power to control or otherwise shape what people can read and access online. It is perfectly acceptable and in fact desirable for companies to set clear rules about what people can say and do on their platforms. However, RDR's research has consistently shown that companies lack transparency about what the rules are and what actions they take to enforce them, or in some cases to not enforce them. This makes it difficult or impossible to hold companies accountable for what actions they take, or in many cases fail to take, to police content or activities that breach their rules. A second major issue is the lack of transparency about the relationships between governments and companies, about how online content is censored or internet access is otherwise restricted. This lack of transparency leaves internet users vulnerable to unaccountable censorship, to restrictions of content or access, and to mass and targeted surveillance, which can put journalists, activists, and human rights defenders at risk. So then, how can governments in the OSCE region and globally work to ensure that they're meeting their obligations to protect human rights online? And how can tech companies be held accountable to ensure that fundamental freedom of expression and information rights are respected? The first step is that tech companies cannot respect human rights unless governments do too. So governments should therefore commit to conduct human rights due diligence to ensure that domestic laws and their implementation are consistent with international human rights standards. Laws that may affect freedom of expression and information should be subject to human rights impact assessments. Consistent with human rights standards, any restrictions of this right must be prescribed by law and necessary to achieve a legitimate and proportionate aim. Governments should pass legislation that enables strong corporate governance and oversight of human rights issues, and requiring companies to conduct risk assessments that identify and mitigate potential human rights harms that could occur in relation to the use of the company's platform, service, or device. Governments should prioritize transparency. They should publish regular and accessible data disclosing the volume, nature, and purpose for all government demands made to companies affecting users' freedom of expression, such as demands to censor or block content, or to shut down or otherwise restrict internet access. Governments should also require companies to disclose information about policies for enforcing rules or shaping speech, and to disclose meaningful and comprehensive information about the actions they take to restrict content or internet access. Government should ensure adequate recourse or remedy. People have the right to meaningful and effective remedy, including legal recourse, when their freedom of expression rights are violated. Government should ensure that individuals have a clear right to legal recourse when these rights are violated by any government authority or corporate entity, including when the violation occurs as a result of a government demand. And finally, government engagement. Governments should work proactively and collaboratively with one another, as well as with civil society and the private sector, to establish a positive roadmap for internet governance that is designed to advance an internet that supports and sustains human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we come to the discussion. Before the discussion, I would like to make some points of order so that everybody understands how it will go on. Our session ends at 6 o'clock. I need to reserve some time for a possible right of reply of the delegations in the end. The speakers will come both from the governments and from the civil society and from the other participants like the press. I request those from the civil society to speak from the table across from me. And if you don't speak, please don't occupy the seat next to the microphone so that everybody will have an easy access to the microphone. Please speak in a constructive way so as to help the conference, this meeting, and provide recommendations to participating states, to OSCE in the sense of the topic of today's session. Please also speak for not more than 3 minutes. That is so far the time limit that we set for the speakers. If you have longer speeches, please provide them to document distribution. They will be prominently made available to everyone here, and focus just on the recommendations. We would like that you speak only in the capacities of your registration. That is the way you are registered, and we expect you to name your organization exactly as you were registered, and speak in this capacity, not as a proxy in any way. Filming or the visual filming of this session is not allowed, so please refrain from recording everybody's or somebody's speech. There is live streaming, and so this can be used if you are interested in a recording. Again, it goes beyond saying that all interventions should be presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. And one other thing is that at the end, if we have time, I would request the introducer, Amy Brulette, to summarize the discussion in as much as it reflects your points and or maybe provides other points that you might find interesting from your position. At this point, I start the discussion, and my list now has 46 rather entries. And the first is Sweden on behalf of the European Union. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'm honored to speak on behalf of the European Union. Freedom of expression is a core value of the European Union. It is a human right for all, a cornerstone of democracy, and serves as an enabler to other human rights, including the freedom of religion or belief and of peaceful assembly and association. Freedom of expression is also a cornerstone of the OSCE comprehensive concept of security. There is a clear and positive interconnection between democratic, peaceful, and prosperous societies that contribute to security and free expression and an independent, pluralistic media. The EU is deeply worried about the increasing challenges to freedom of expression and media freedom in many parts of the OSCE region. Digital technologies have expanded global communications and the possibility for everyone to seek, receive, and impart information as provided for under international law. While agreed in Milan 2018 that the development of journalism and technology contributes to public debate, many governments have further restricted online speech. The EU has spoken out against new legislation in Russia, which cracks down on so-called disrespect to the state in the online sphere, including officials and public bodies, and the spread of deliberately untrue information. This can lead to fines or 15 days of administrative arrest, and fines and blocking of the information resources respectively. Also in Russia, new legislation on so-called sovereign internet could be used to cut access to the global internet. In Turkey, restrictions on online freedom of expression continues to increase. The EU is concerned about the court ruling blocking access to over 130 news sites and social media accounts in Turkey. The EU also remains concerned about the practice of unduly blocking online news sources in Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. Challenges to the exercise of human rights online are manifold. As stated in the 20th anniversary joint declaration by the OSCE, RFOM, and other experts, freedom of expression requires digital infrastructure that is robust, universal, and regulated so as to maintain it as a free, accessible, secure, and open space for all. All participating states should recognize the right to access and use of the Internet as human right, and to respect and reinforce the principle of network neutrality. Participating states have an important role to play in upholding their positive obligations to safeguard the right to freedom of expression online, reflected also in the Sofia 2004 commitments. All human rights that exist offline must also be protected online. Any restrictions must be in line with international law, taking into account that freedom of expression also protects information and ideas that may shock, offend, and disturb. It's on this basis that the EU is engaging with IT companies and civil society at large to address serious challenges in the context of digital technologies. The EU proactively promotes human rights in cyberspace, including in the area of data protection and privacy.
Please
In
conclude.
conclusion, we would like to put forward the following recommendations to participating states. Fully respect their international human rights obligation and commitments on freedom of expression and media freedom, in particular to refrain from any restrictions on freedom of expression which are not in line with international law and international standards. Create and ensure a safe, open, free, enabling environment for independent and pluralistic media online. Engage constructively with the RFOM. Respect the mandate and autonomy of the representative and provide them with the necessary resources to fulfill the mandate. The following countries align themselves with this statement: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Iceland, and Moldova. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next is Russian State Television and Radio Broadcasting Company, to be followed by Rights and Freedoms of Turkmenistan Citizens. Пожалуйста, вам.
You have the floor.
In Russian.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, distinguished organizers of this wonderful meeting today. As a director of international relations of one of the largest television and radio holdings, I take part in many international structures of journalists and other many initiatives. This is why today I would like to very briefly share my own observations regarding what is happening in the world of the Internet and the trends we see there. The full report will be presented to the Secretariat in electronic format. In our vastly, swiftly changing world, we have seen how two phenomena have come up against each other. Fake news on the one hand, which was first used by the United States president with regard to his own national media, and my American friends are now saying that the CNN really stands for the Clinton News Network. And secondly, is that we have a drift from people who have gone from traditional media and electronic news to the Internet. So these two ships, so to speak, that have met in the night have meant that now we have rather various forms being development of how the Internet is being influenced and how the content on the Internet is being changed and influenced. For example, there's a new rule introduced onto YouTube where the advertisers are going to influence content. That's the commercial side of things. But there are others. In the UK, for example, there is a consideration of automatic cyber system that would block fake news and other forms of disinformation. I take part in another initiative, which is called the GTI, the Journalists Trust Initiative. It might be interesting for you to learn how this idea was born. Well, I only have 45 seconds left. Time flies. But in order to create a white list of media to be formed that would be given priority in the financing and distribution of information and in placing it on the Internet. But frankly, it looks like we are building a new Berlin Wall of the Internet, and it is being built from the West and not from the East. As a community, what should we do? We should demand so that the keys to information analysis and Cyberwatch and for other journalist initiatives should be open to the public. Thank you. Thank you very much, Piotr.
Rights and freedoms of all Turkmenistan citizens to be followed by delegation of Russian Federation.
Спасибо. Thank you very much. Turkmenistan is one of the countries where there is no independent media. The government is doing everything within its power to ensure that no information is disseminated about human rights in Turkmenistan. They're also preventing Turkmeni citizens from receiving any information from independent mass media or independent organizations. So the internet is basically closed. It's under the wraps of the security services of Turkmenistan. In order to prevent the spread of prevent independent media spreading information about fake news, there was an instance where there was information about the president of Turkmenistan dying. And in fact, those who believed this news were arrested quite quickly. However, just before this fake news was disseminated, there was a coordination committee meeting, the Road to Freedom, which met. This committee calls on Turkmenistani expats to take part in the building of a new state, a new government. And in fact, they were offering jobs in the parliament and in the government. Seemingly, information was spread according to which the Turkmeni president was handing over his powers voluntarily. And in fact, Saparov Muradov and Mr. Khudyrov, the former Prosecutor General of Turkmenistan, were involved in this effort. It said that once a security serviceman, always a security serviceman. What then happened is that threats were disseminated. Mr. Tsamarmadov also lodged an application with the General Prosecutor Service of the Russian Federation, calling on anyone who had two nationalities and was criticizing the government of Turkmenistan to cease and desist. All of this was done to once again intimidate human rights defenders and independent journalists. The government must cease persecuting independent journalists and independent media. Our citizens have the right to access information to express their opinion about what's going on in Turkmenistan. Thank you. Thank you very much for keeping your comments brief.
Followed by Tajik Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. In recent years, the area of the OSCE has been undergoing unprecedented development of information technologies. Modern states and media corporations and individuals are part of this process of the transformation of the distribution of information to digital information. The flow of information in the global internet has become a trend in regulation in states all over the world. We need to create a balance between the priority of the freedom of expression and free access to information and the realization of the state's rights to ensure their own state security. Social networks and blogs are the new platforms for the societies which have lost trust in traditional media. The technology of spreading dangerous information on the internet without anyone taking responsibility for it has led to the violation of interests and laws for citizens as the users of information as well as the rights of states. The Russian Federation is following closely the trends of defending the rights of citizens on the internet. Many of these are anonymous and are registering on servers of third states. In national laws, we need to have the means on the use of ICT based on the principle of a national information sovereignty of the states in their own segment of the internet space. But we are against that using the excuse of national security or of combating disinformation to close media or other websites based on where they come from. Also, a number of Western states are seeing a trend in making their regulation more serious, more stringent, if anything, of presenting an alternative point of view and strengthening the roles of national authorities. The French initiative in forming black and white lists of media and journalists and indicators of trust towards journalists. The point of this is to develop criteria to divide information into trustworthy and untrustworthy sources. The independence for initiatives of the UK and France have taken an international initiative supposedly to fight disinformation and to improve the quality of journalism. The French are planning to sign during the 74th session of the UN General Assembly session a new international treaty on the principles of the functioning of the global information space. This is an initiative in trying to squeeze out international obligations and to provide for free access to information, to create new rules of an information regime. The media freedom, which is set down in the OSCE international obligations, including the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. In conclusion, we wanted to say the Russian Federation continues to be guided by the basic principles of freedom of expression, of opinion, and media, and free access to information under the OSCE obligations and commitments. The full version will be given to the Secretary. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Center for Human Rights, to be followed by Forum of Tajik Democratic Free Thinkers.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, representative of the Tajik government speak here about freedom of expression loudly, or when you meet the Tajik diplomats, they say a lot of improvements in the field of freedom of expression, but the reality is something totally else. Tajikistan is a country where the activists and ordinary people are afraid of pushing the button of likes and shares when they use social networks such as Facebook or Odnoklassniki, because they know well what will be the consequences of pushing like and share. Is this called as freedom of expression in the 21st century? In June 2018, the Parliament of Tajikistan changed the article of the criminal code that putting likes and shares on the social networks is considered crimes leading to imprisonment of 10 years. So in May 2018, Ali John Sharipov was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison for watching, liking, and sharing videos of a gatherings was held by the Islamic Revival Party abroad. He just pushed the buttons of likes and shares on the videos of speech of Mr. Muhyiddin Kabiri, the chairman of the Islamic Revival Party of Tajikistan and head of the National Alliance of Tajikistan, almost 10 years in prison for just like and shares. How do the Tajik representative and diplomats who are here explain this? 2 months ago, in July 2018, another citizen named Ibrahim Qasimov from Panjaken district also was sentenced to 9 years just for the same reason, pushing likes and shares on the post belong to the opposition. I ask the Tajik representative who are here at this conference to explain how putting a like or share is considered as a crime. I also urge the OSCE to demand the government of Tajikistan to release Ali John Sharipov, Ibrahim Qasimov, and all those citizens who are sentenced just on charges of putting likes and shares on the social networks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Forum of Tajik Democratic Free Thinkers, to be followed by Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan.
Timur Arkisov, председатель форума.
Thank you very much, Marwakisov. Today we heard from Lech Walesa and also the OSCE Secretary General. They all spoke about the end of history in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. Unfortunately, we, the dissenting peoples of Tajikistan, the Tajik Democratic free thinkers are of a different view. We lived in a different dimension up until 1989, and also in the 30s and the 40s. Nazi Germany, also 1934 to 1937, the Great Stalinist Terror. The history of the OSCE, 28 years now, and the 27-year history of the usurper, the dictator Emomali Rachmanov, seem to be occurring in parallel dimensions. Over the course of that period, and especially of late, we've seen the mass media persecuted. In fact, the free media has been gagged. We basically have a monarchy now with a puppet parliament, a puppet court, and a fake propaganda industry, a fake news industry. We've seen that these trolls are working throughout Tajikistan. They're working in universities, in various private enterprises. For instance, the head of the Faculty of Journalism of the National University of Talimandi, he recently called for everyone opposed to the Rachmanov regime to be prosecuted. The press, whenever they mention the president, they must say that he's the president and use all sorts of titles used to revere him. He's sometimes referred to as the savior of our planet. He's compared to Venus, and in fact, sometimes when he takes the floor, the stars are in awe and the planets stop spinning because everyone, including Putin and Xi Jinping, also stop what they're doing and stand there in awe. Access to the internet, to websites publishing alternative views are being blocked. Last year, in 2018, the last independent mass media outlet in the Tajik language, Ajodagon, was closed down, and the editor-in-chief requested asylum in France. Once that newspaper was shut down, in fact, the threats did not stop. They continued. The editor continued receiving threats. Could you please wrap up? Yes. The head of the Communications Ministry has explained the fact that the internet was recently shut down by the fact that the cables were cut. Although when Donald Tusk recently visited Tajikistan, they managed to get the internet up and running again. Could you please wrap up? Yes, just a few recommendations. We need to shut down the monopoly on the means of communications and the communications center, which belongs to the government. Forced registration of all buying SIM cards is also unacceptable. The citizens of Tajikistan want a free, unimpeded internet, free and unimpeded internet access, and also access to independent news outlets. Thank you.
I request everybody to speak within the time limit of 3 minutes and also speak in a respectful manner. Thank you. Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan, to be followed by Political Movement Group 24.
Благодарю вас, уважаемые.
Thank you, moderator, ladies and gentlemen. In recent times in Kazakhstan, we talk a great deal about the criminal liability for defamation. I would like to tell you a little bit about the human rights. In the new penal code, they have remained the criminal liability for harm done. We have seen in world experiments in our criminal code with regard to slander. We need to have a factor that would use the freedom of expression as a slander. Slander is spreading false information that they know is false, that would undermine the reputation of someone. The political rights and rights of expression are based on a caveat in that using and enjoying that right is accompanied with certain responsibilities. It could be linked to certain limitations. These limitations could be linked to enforcing the rights and reputations of individuals, state security, security of the state. And this corresponds to the 39th article of the Constitution of Kazakhstan. Just like in the states of the European Union, in Kazakhstan, we have a balance between private and public interest for defamation. The Human Rights Commission, together with the OSCE office in Nur-Sultan, for 4 years has been holding workshops on international and national mechanisms of defending human rights. And these workshops are throughout Kazakhstan in remote areas, villages and towns. We are grateful to the program office of the OSCE in Nur-Sultan for helping us hold these workshops and training sessions on human rights defense. What's important here is in ensuring that we provide for the rights of individuals and anyone else who may be living in Kazakhstan at any time in using information, having access to information, and the dissemination of information. These are very useful and good mechanisms, and our people are very pleased with it. We use this information provided by the OSCE in our workshops with regard to international and national legislation on this front. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Movement Group 24, to be followed by Regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Serlev Komnezhonjav. I represent Group 24. Today, the freedom of the media and the freedom of expression in Tajikistan has gone from bad to worse compared to last year. The government has clamped down on the freedom of opinion and on access to all kinds of information. Journalists and mass media outlets are constantly feeling the pressure exerted on them by the government. As my colleague outlined, in the May of this year, a Tajikistani citizen, Aljon Sharipov, was sentenced to 9.5 years behind bars for liking and sharing opposition articles. He was accused of publicly calling for a violent overthrow of the constitutional order using the mass media and or the internet. That's just one like and one instance where he shared articles. And there are many such examples. Any objective criticism of the authorities is interpreted as an insult to the president. And, in fact, many amendments have been made to the criminal code of Tajikistan in order to combat such instances and such behavior. The free expression of your opinion online, any opinions which are not aligned with the regime's ideology, is often results in harassment and prosecution by the law enforcement agencies. Many journalists have been forced to leave the country, and many sites and media outlets now criticize the government from abroad. The authorities have had a monopoly over access to the internet since 2018, means they can block any internet resource without asking internet service providers to help them. The only independent site, Asia Plus, was inaccessible in Tajikistan for 10 years. Of course, the authorities say that the sites were blocked because of a technical glitch. Nonetheless, it must be said that Asia Plus was blocked because it refused to publish a number of articles that it was sent by the authorities. Currently, there are a number of TV channels in Tajikistan, but they're all pro-government. The only program which gives the opportunity for everyone to speak, irrespective of their political views, is Sadoy Mardum, that program, which is in fact shown online via YouTube. Thank you very much. Well, I will submit the full text of my statement to the Secretariat.
Regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy named after Paisi Hilendarsky, to be followed by Open Dialogue Foundation.
Уважаемые дамы и господа,
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Radina. I represent not only national minorities who are Crimea. I am the head editor of the Bulgarian newspaper Izmit, but I'm also as a journalist of the parliamentary newspaper The Izvestia of Crime. I will tell you some about what I have witnessed myself. I'm sorry, you need to be speaking on behalf of the organization on behalf of which you have registered.
5 лет прошло.
5 years have gone by since in Crimea the referendum was held. And for all of these years, the unfair and untruthful rhetoric about annexation and occupation has existed. In March of 2014, we have seen that in Simferopol reminded us of Babylon back in those days.
Point of order taken. На одну секунду прервитесь.
To ask you to guide the participant to speak on the topic of today's discussion and the topic of today's session. Otherwise she needs to be ruled of order. Thank you.
Thank you. Можете продолжать.
You may continue. At that time, we had accreditation of over 2,000 journalists from many countries of the world, from Japan to Canada, and of course from every country in Europe. They had free access to all of the polling stations. We had press conferences held directly online. Journalists saw from themselves that the people were making their choice freely in Crimea. There were no guns or tanks in the street. Why is it then when we came back home, they did not say the truth? Maybe because they saw that in their own countries, their freedom of speech was curtailed. Many journalists who came to the referendum in my country were ordered not to give a positive assessment of what was happening. So what was the result? Is that the non-recognition of the Russian status of Crimea is a stalemate in the world. I would like to suggest that we should have an OEC press tour organized by journalists from European countries. They can come to Crimea, talk to people there, and learn the truth, and they will see for themselves that these people have become free citizens of Russia if their own choice. They are not going to change their minds. I believe that it is not right to demand that the Russian citizens who are prisoners, political prisoners, be freed in Russia is absolutely not right, because Publisher Ahmet and others are still held prisoner.
Of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Maxim Sitnikov, Open Dialogue Foundation. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the Open Dialogue Foundation is an NGO with 10 years experience of protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in the post-Soviet area. Today I would like to focus your attention on the situation with freedom of expression and media in Kazakhstan. Since the last Human Dimension implementation meeting, we do not observe a progress in this field. Freedom of expression in Kazakhstan is still very limited. Kenjibek Abishev, Almat Jumagulov, Ablavaz Jumayev, Aset Abishev, Balathan Junusov, Serik Zhahin were jailed for criticizing the authorities in social media. Few years ago, Kazakhstan shut down all local independent media outlets. Journalists of Radio Liberty and Current Time, who are covering protests and politically motivated trials in Kazakhstan, are prosecuted, face obstruction, arbitrary detention, administrative punishment, and expulsion. The reaction of the editorial office of Radio Liberty in Kazakhstan on these violations is disappointing. Journalist of Radio Liberty, Saniya Toyken, was detained 5 times from the beginning of this year. Journalist of Current Times, Svetlana Glushkova, was detained twice during the protest against renaming of Astana in March. This is a picture of Svetlana Glushkova, and this is how the freedom of media in Kazakhstan looks like. On the day of presidential election, on 9 June, and during the following 3 days of mass protests, at least 12 journalists were detained in Kazakhstan despite the fact they performed their professional duties. Police interrogated them and deleted their video footage. As a result of forcible detention, correspondent of the France press agency, Chris Rickleton, suffered a hematoma under the eye. On 6 July, at least 5 journalists were detained during mass protests. The editor of Uralsk Week journal, Lukpan Akhmedyarov, was convicted and fined. Kazakhstan misused migration mechanism to expel Ukrainian journalist Alexander Gorokhovsky, French journalist Vincent Prado, and journalist from Kyrgyzstan Jazgul Egemberdieva from its territory. The Open Dialogue Foundation demands all OSCE participant states to condemn violations of freedom of speech, media freedom, rights of journalists in Kazakhstan. We ask OSCE and the European Union to activate its missions in Kazakhstan. We also ask embassies of the EU states in Nur-Sultan for visa support for Kazakhstani human rights defenders who apply for participation in international events. It is regretful that today the Embassy of Austria in Nur-Sultan refused visa application for human rights activists Bota Aljanova and Aliya Isbasarova. We consider it is a barrier for free information exchange that would allow to know the truth about Kazakhstan. We appeal to the US government to make a constant monitoring of the work of the editorial office of Radio Liberty in Kazakhstan and to demand from the government of Kazakhstan to stop prosecute journalists. Thank you.
Thank you. And I understand that there is not enough space at the table, but please sit behind the table which says civil society. Civil Chamber of the Russian Federation, to be followed by International Public Fund, Russian Peace Foundation.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alexander Malkevich. I'm a Russian journalist, and I'm here representing the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. In that chamber, I preside over the Committee on the Development of the Information Society, the mass media, and other means of communication. Speaking here today, I'd like to talk about a topic which I think is relevant to all of us, and that is censorship. Censorship of social networks on the internet and various other platforms. Regardless of what country you represent, what language you write in, you've all been affected by this. I'm sure you're all aware that at the outset, social media platforms were presented as platforms free from censorship. Anyone could express their opinions on social media. However, of late, we've seen a change in policy vis-à-vis users. Those who publicly express support for various political views, those who share opinions which are not in line with the owners of these platforms, very often they're censored. Over 1.5 million posts were deleted over a 3-month period, and a year later, 3 million posts were deleted. Furthermore, there are more and more moderators who have been hired to delete these comments from these platforms. Very often, writers, journalists, entire media outlets are subjected to such treatment. For instance, Freeford Project and Anti-Media are two media outlets which were banned. They have no links to Russia. They're American media outlets which were banned because of their views. Other accounts have been blocked. These are often accounts directly or indirectly linked to the Russian Federation, including our major media outlets such as Russia Today and Sputnik. Individual accounts have also been affected. 7 accounts related to the Sputnik media outlet were deleted. Furthermore, activists and journalists, both left-leaning and right-leaning, have also been subjected to this treatment. However, what's most worrying is that there's no list of criteria, no list of what is inadmissible on social media. The existing criteria are used in a selective manner. Furthermore, suffice to say that there are many radicals operating on these platforms, calling on people to harass and intimidate those who hold opposing views. We believe that it's important to develop legislation which would clamp down on censorship on social media. We need to come up with an exhaustive list of grounds for blocking or deleting any content on social media. I will submit my text in full to the Secretariat.
To be followed by Krymskaya Gazeta.
Thank you, the Russian Peace Fund, Natalie Salutsky. it may seem paradoxical, but our critics will see that the freedom of the speech in the Russian media may seem to be much higher than in the West. Sincere criticism of Russia in saying this is only because people don't know about reality. The pundits are just repeating what they hear elsewhere. Yes, there is official propaganda in Russia on official television, but show me a country where this does not exist. And the Western criticisms are only thinking about this. But in Russia, there are thousands of media, and they are often in dispute. They express many different points of view. Basically, we are at a time of public discussions in Russia, from building new towns about the personality of Stalin, about economic problems and the outcome of the Second World War. The social space is replete of many disputes and discussions based on varied forms of information. But when we talk about the internet, it's a kind of storm where many people are criticizing the Putin period. We shouldn't be saying we shouldn't have disputes or insults. But that's not the problem. The problem is that we need to have all kinds of disputes. The radio station Echo Moskvy, I don't always agree with them, but they have the right to their own opinion. And in Russia today, there is a real spirit of people expressing their views. I don't understand why people are criticizing this today. The people in my country that live in their own realities, when we see this type of criticism, we see that the trust in the West is undermined. You can really believe me when I say that Russia is much more democratic than the West if you really delve into all of the various forms of so-called innovations that we see in the West. And I'm not only talking about the freedom of the media, and I'm talking here about unjust attacks against Russia. In the past, Russia strived to be like the West, but the West's striving to improve Russia has led to many rifts in my country. Basically, it means don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Thank you.
Анатолий Самуилович,
Thank you very much. The Crimean Gazeta.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria Volkonskaya, Crimea, Russian Federation. I'm the editor-in-chief of Krymskaya Gazeta and the Krymsky Journal. I wanted to...
Продолжать?
Can I continue?
выключите микрофон на минуту.
Could you please turn off your microphone for a moment?
I would like to say that HDM as an event with participation of the OSCE participation states and NGOs. Crimea and Sevastopol are parts of Ukraine, although temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. Hence, this platform cannot be used for presentation of views of the occupying authorities of Crimea, as this representative is the head of the official propaganda leaflet of the so-called Council of Ministers of the so-called Republic of Crimea. Any attempts to misuse the HDM and to legitimize actions marked with flagrant violations of the OSCE founding principles, one of them which is territorial integrity, respect to territorial integrity and sovereignty, in particular, and inalienability of frontiers, must be immediately prevented. We request, therefore, that speaker not be given the floor and ask to leave the meeting.
One point of order.
Пожалуйста.
Yes, please.
В связи с прозвучавшими
In light of these statements and accusations directed at the Russian Federation, accusing us of occupying and annexing Crimea and Sevastopol, we believe it's inappropriate to use the OSCE as a platform to undermine the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. We call on the moderator to put an end to this practice. The speaker took the floor and stated their full title as per the registration documentation. Therefore, we don't understand why the speaker should not have the right to speak. Thank you very much. I can continue? Yes, we registered.
One delegation claimed that there shouldn't be the spreading of unconsensual meanings or statements here in the OSCE. So there is a respective OSCE decision that recognizes the legal status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea as integral part of Ukraine, as reflected in Journal number 3 of the 27th meeting of Committee of Senior Officials in Prague in 1994. There is no other decision, so consensus was not broken. If the consensus was broken and ODIHR believes so, ODIHR, who is guiding this meeting on behalf of the OSCE chairmanship, should be guided under the principal status.
The decision was taken in 2014.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
A point of order, I'm sorry.
That will never finish. Yeah, please continue.
ОБСЕ не уполномочено определить.
The OSCE does not have the jurisdiction to decide which territory is part of which country. The representative of that mass media outlet is speaking in his or her capacity as the representative of that mass media outlet. So that's the rationale for giving them the floor.
Можно я скажу?
Can I just say one thing? Yes, of course.
This session is about freedom of the media and freedom of expression. We are not discussing now the status of Crimea or Sevastopol. You may continue as representative of Krymskaya Gazeta, and please talk on the topic of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Regarding integrity, I want to repeat that we, the Crimean people, made a choice in 2014, and I will be returning to that point. Turning now to the mass media in the Crimea, 323 media outlets have been registered. We have national mass media outfits, which are very active, 103 such outlets. Many mass media outlets have also been registered by the Federal Center. So, as you can see, there are many more media outlets than I mentioned. So, in such a context, censorship, lack of information, that's impossible, neither in technical terms nor in physical terms. Some representatives of Western states have directed their criticism against the purported persecution of journalists by the government. And in fact, in the Ukraine, they can constantly repeat these allegations. All sorts of politicized information is disseminated by NGOs located not in the Crimea. I brought a copy of the Krymsky Journal newspaper in English for colleagues who are interested. You might like to peruse it to acquaint yourself with what the status of freedom of the media is in Crimea. For 85 years now, our newspaper has been publishing information. We've got a newspaper like that. We've got a social media account where we publish information about the lives of ordinary Crimeans. Very often, we hear people say that they want to go to the Crimea, but they cannot because they want to continue expressing solidarity with the Ukraine. But then I don't understand. I don't understand. What are those fighting for freedom of expression in the Crimea fighting for? I call on all those to come to Crimea to join the ranks of international delegations coming to the Crimea. 150 such delegations visit the country every year, and see for yourselves the fact that Crimean journalists can and do work in their field. I've been working as a TV journalist, as a print journalist for 15 years now, and let me reiterate that we have met the high standards in terms of the status of mass media. So if anyone can convince you of the opposite, make sure that they do that, having visited the Crimea. Come to Crimea, come to the Russian Federation. You'll be very welcome there. And I will submit the full version of my statement to the Secretariat.
The floor is going to Sputnik, to be followed by Lithuania.
Good afternoon. I would like to talk about the harassment of Russian language journalists in the Baltics. The international agency Radio Sputnik is regularly up against the pressures from the governments. This is especially notable in European countries in the Baltics, where there are appeals to block Russian media all the time. In some countries, in Latvia, in July of 2015, Latvia blocked Baltnews Web website under the excuse that supposedly they were threatening the independence of Ukraine, and the colleagues were facing legal liability for their work. This is also against the Treaty on Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, the Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and the EU Agreement on the Freedom of the Media and Pluralism in the Media. This is how they are trying to clear out the media space from those they don't agree with. For 12 hours, one of our journalists was questioned in the police office. They are rebranding themselves now. They call themselves the Service of State Security. He was persecuted as the editor, and he was pressured not to use the photo content from Sputnik. However, thank God this did not go through. In Lithuania, in 2012, they blocked Sputnik Lithuania for copyright violations. Supposedly, this had been the case. The blocking was removed, and they removed the reference to the photo. As the head of Sputnik Litva in May, I was banned entry into Lithuania for 5 years. This was an action of the State Security Office of Lithuania against me personally. In March of 2019, a Russian journalist was not allowed to an event in Vilnius, and the European Federation of Journalists then sued that office. Estonia. State officials are banned from communicating with journalists from Sputnik, and there is a recommendation on their site on how to work with journalists. Basically, they call Sputnik a pseudo news agency, which is also slanderous. Many journalists had to quit their jobs, and one of the recommendations is also not to deal with the Sputnik journalists. Considering what I've said, I would like you to ensure that the rights and freedoms of journalists should be defended throughout Europe and in the Baltics, and to put an end to the pressure put on Russian media. I will provide the full text to the Secretary. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Followed by Association of Central Asian Migrants. Ksenia?
Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, on behalf of EU, I would like to reiterate our strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Russian Federation, and we will not recognize it. We therefore regret the attempts by some participants of this meeting to use a legitimate opportunity for discussion and dialogue to make points relating to a situation that is in contradiction with Helsinki principles. And now I'll turn to my national statement. Freedom of expression comes at a great price, and those who are bringing the truth and uncovering human rights violations are being attacked or imprisoned on fake charges without due process. Democratic governments and democratic media are facing the same demons, disinformation and fake news. Lithuania is very concerned that media is being used by some states with their malicious propaganda aiming to influence democratic processes, including during elections. We must promote independent journalism and strengthen society's critical thinking and resilience. Safety of journalists and media workers online and offline, especially women journalists, and effective countering of disinformation has been a long-standing top priority for my country. Lithuania is among the initiators of the informal groups of Friends for Safety of Journalists at the UN in New York and Geneva, the UNESCO, and recently at the OSCE. Safety of Journalists is part of our campaign for the seat in the UN Human Rights Council. We actively support the initiative on International Partnership for Information and Democracy initiated by France and Reporters Without Borders, and also joined the Global Pledge on Media Freedom launched by the UK and Canada earlier this year. During recent years, Lithuania has been actively working to counter disinformation, which, sponsored by the autocratic countries, has no borders. We are investing in enhancing society's cyber and information resilience. As an example of such a tool is an online platform, Debunk.lt, created by the Lithuanian media outlets in cooperation with Google. The reform and his dedicated team's efforts are crucial in protecting the pillars of modern democracy, and Lithuania would like to extend its strong support for the tireless work they do. We are convinced that full implementation of OSCE decision on the safety of journalists is of utmost importance, and the update of the reform guidebook would be beneficial in this regard. Last but not least, I would like to extend my country's strong support for all international and grassroots organizations, journalists, and media workers who are tirelessly implementing a function of a watchdog worldwide 24/7 in preserving freedom of expression. I thank you.
Thank you, Donatas, and thank you for being on time as well. Association of Central Asian Migrants, to be followed by Citizens Labor Rights Protection League.
Good afternoon, everybody. Over the last few years in Tajikistan, we've seen a trend. The freedom of expression is worsening. The freedom of expression is under threat in this totalitarian regime. We've seen greater pressure exerted on independent media, exerted by the authorities. There are further restrictions on the work of journalists. Journalists are intimidated, they're threatened. This is now common currency in Tajikistan. For instance, we've seen the independent media circumscribed. As a result, Ozdagon and Tujnus, two independent media outlets, were forced to shut down. The founders of those two media outlets have now left the country. Asia Plus, a news portal, has also seen restrictions imposed on it, and everyone's heard of that example, I'm sure. International experts have called on the government of Tajikistan to stop blocking Asia Plus on a number of occasions. It must be said that these three media outlets, which I mentioned, independent outlets, were considered to be the best of the best in Tajikistan and had great exposure. Therefore, what we see is that no other media outlet can fill the gap they've left, can provide independent information. However, it is not only the independent media that is in such dire straits. What we're also seeing is that the authoritarian regime is also restricting the work of the state media. The government is constantly exerting pressure on journalists working for state-owned media. The Committee for National Security is also imposing restrictions on several state-owned media outlets. As a result of the stringent censorship, some articles are not being published because instructions have arrived from people in high places telling the outlets what to publish and what not to publish. Very often, articles are published under fake names. Some of these articles target the opposition and the leader of the opposition. As Tajikistan is a member of the international community, it must uphold all of its human rights obligations. We call on the international community to pinpoint the activities of the government of Tajikistan. We call on everyone to pinpoint this problem and to put an end to the unlawful persecution of independent journalists. Society cannot exist without an independent and free media. Therefore, we want the media platforms which were shut down to be reopened. That's a third thing. Fourth, we want amendments to be made to the legislation to ensure that the free media is allowed to flourish. Thank you.
Labor Rights Protection League, to be followed by RT.
Thank you. When the human dimension events started in the beginning of the 90s, the internet didn't really exist. Especially, there were no social networks or other innovative ways of distributing information. What's interesting is that since that time, the agenda of our event has practically not changed. When we are in an era now where anyone can create information and to disseminate it amongst these new types of news, we have a great deal of new fake news. Fake news is not something that creates a threat for society and states, but is a global threat for human rights. This is why we need to look at the sources of this threat. In Azerbaijan, hundreds of people who have become refugees and political asylum seekers in Western European countries every day are provoking information, fake news that leads to hatred, violence, violent regime change, and all forms of provocation. All of this comes from Western countries, France, Germany, Belgium, against other countries. In other countries, we see the same thing. All of this freedom of expression in Western Europe is financed by certain people. It is also created by the security services of some other countries in order to give rise to bloody conflicts in third countries. Somehow, this is not a topic which has deserved the attention of participating states. The representative of the media, freedom of the media, isn't really concerned with this form of danger. Some countries are elaborating laws on this front. For example, there's a 240-page document to prevent fake news and manipulation. However, when third countries adopt circumscribing measures, then campaigns are waged against them. Why aren't we including this on our agenda? Why aren't we discussing the problem of fake news and information? We already have the guiding principles on fake news in the OSCE and how to combat it and what participating states should do to combat fake news while still respecting fundamental rights and freedoms. All of these questions remain open. Thank you.
Спасибо. RT to be followed by Article 19.
Okay. There's an absolute need to ensure that governments that claim to work to uphold the principles of a free press are genuine in their actions. As a representative of a global media organization, I hear daily accounts of the problems journalists face in reporting, including questionable and often illegal incarcerations, blocked access to global social media tools and platforms, the illegitimate barring of reporters from places like France's Élysée Palace, based purely on false accusations and administration's whim. That's why when we encounter the prospect of international efforts that promise to shine a light on and even counter such hampering of press freedoms, we stand up and take note. Under this guise, the haughtily named Global Conference on Media Freedom, co-hosted by the British and Canadian governments, took place in July of this year. In spite of secretive and preclusive accreditation, and the assembly of an imbalanced cast of participants, for instance, one-sidedly debating such important topics as Syria, something that in conferences it seems it's best achieved if you only have a pro-regime change personalities, it seems. The conference made its case as the pinnacle of media freedom leading the world. So, it is not without abject irony, therefore, that such an enterprise would fall at the first hurdle, failing to even provide for press freedoms at the very event itself, barring our network and others from attending the event and providing many contradictory stories and excuses as to why, from the number of available media seats to downright libelous accusations in our regard. It isn't uncommon for regimes to claim one thing while doing another, and unfortunately we've seen it in the UK before. After all, it is there that the government professes the independence of media regulators, while on the other hand, actively pressuring these regulators through public calls to restrict the broadcasting rights of channels, even those with a far better record than its own national broadcaster. It even isn't just the refusal to allow one of the world's largest media organizations access to an event purporting to be the home of media freedom that should concern us all. Of course, it paints a hypocritical picture of the UK and Canadian foreign offices who arranged the event. But more than that, it shows the power to misinform and curtail genuine fight to uphold media freedoms, a fight that we as journalists must battle for each and every day, with a patent attempt to stifle inconvenient voices and alternative opinions. Such hypocritical approach, events, and initiatives must be opposed by all members here. Thank you.
Thank you. Article 19 to be followed by World Uyghur Congress.
Thank you to the RFOM for this session on internet freedom and to Ranking Digital Rights for their report. This is a priority area for Article 19, in particular in our work on social media councils and our global campaign Missing Voices, which we will launch next month. Missing Voices calls on social media platforms to provide a human rights-centered process that guarantees notice, the right to appeal, and transparent reporting when content is blocked and accounts removed. Turning then to the situation of internet freedom in Turkey. Article 19 is deeply concerned by new online censorship measures. In the last 6 weeks alone, broad additional powers have been given to the radio and television regulator RETUK, which extends the agency's control to foreign and domestic online broadcasters and threatens their existence through a costly and opaque licensing regime. In addition, dozens of websites and hundreds of news pages have been blocked since the 1st of August. These include the web pages of our partner SUSMA, which were blocked simply because they reported on the censorship of other news sites which were publishing investigations into corruption implicating President Erdogan's family. The RETUK regulation, which came into force on the 1st of August, will require all online content news providers, including online streaming services such as YouTube and Netflix, and online news sites to obtain a license from the government-controlled state television and radio regulator. The regulation makes RETUK responsible for monitoring their online content and requires content providers to abide by RETUK's unspecified standards or face revocation for their license and the blocking of their platforms. The regulation will also be applicable to platforms based outside of the country, meaning it provides unprecedented control over access to information online in Turkey. It is still unclear to what extent these regulations will be applied to individual users within the country. As you know, internet freedom in Turkey is already severely restricted. The 2007 Internet Law and subsequent 2015 amendments have provided the government broad powers to block online content, and a further emergency decree transferred significant power to the executive to block content without judicial oversight. As of December 2018, 220,000 sites and more than 150,000 URLs were subject to blocking orders. Wikipedia has been blocked in the country since 2017, a case now pending before the Turkish Constitutional Court and the European Court of Human Rights. And the Turkish government now makes more requests for content takedown from Twitter on the basis of national laws than any other country in the world. Furthermore, tweets are systematically used as evidence in cases of criminal prosecutions of journalists and civil society, with almost 100,000 accounts investigated and nearly 50,000 individuals subject to criminal investigations for their social media posts alone. We urge the OSCE states to increase pressure on Turkey to abide by their human rights commitments and to not allow the continued destruction of human rights online and offline in the country. We call on Turkey to repeal the RETUK legislation and the Internet Law and to amend it to ensure that online content is only blocked on the basis of judicial decisions and where it is strictly necessary and proportionate to a legitimate objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. World Uyghur Congress to be followed by Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen. Sorry about my job.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm speaking today on behalf of the World Uyghur Congress. While advancements in digital technology and internet can serve to facilitate communication and engagement, it can also be used to silence dissenting voices and human rights activists. Repressive technology tested in one country can be exported throughout the world for authoritarian governments to oppress and control their own citizens. This has certainly been the case with the Uyghur people in the Uyghur Autonomous Region in China. Repressive digital technologies tested on the Uyghur people are now being exported to other governments around the world, especially in Central Asia and OSCE member states. In the Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, the Chinese government has implemented one of the most sophisticated repressive systems of security and surveillance in the world. Freedom of expression and information, as well as respect for basic rights, are virtually non-existent. Every details of the lives of Uyghur people are tracked and recorded by the Chinese police, who scan their phones at checkpoints. If Uyghurs are found to have communicated with friends or relatives outside China, or if they communicate any form of religious content, they risk being sent to an internment camp where over 1 million Uyghurs, innocent Uyghurs, are being arbitrarily detained at the moment. Most Uyghurs living outside China have not heard from their family members since April 2017. Human Rights Watch documented the system of surveillance. Police use an app to constantly upload information about individuals, which connects to the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, a program which aggregates data about people and flags those it deems problematic, often leading to arrests. It tracks information such as blood type, height, DNA, religious atmosphere, political affiliations, and even how much electricity people use. These technologies have created an unbearable dystopian atmosphere where every word in online communication is monitored by the CCP and very little information gets out of the region. And these technologies are now being exported all over the world. The Serbian government announced it will be installing hundreds of Huawei-made security cameras with facial recognition technology in Belgrade. It has also been reported that similar technology is being installed in Tajikistan as part of a Safe Cities program funded by the Chinese government. Ecuadorian authorities are also using Chinese technology to expand its domestic surveillance. Zimbabwe has reportedly been importing artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology from China. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are also reportedly importing this repressive technology from China, as claimed in an ITV documentary. Uyghurs living outside China also having their right to freedom of expression violated even in OSCE member states. Through WeChat and WhatsApp, the Chinese government threatens Uyghur activists and arrests their family members in China if they dare speak out and exercise their freedom of expression. Some OSCE member states are even facilitating the Chinese government harassment and human rights violations against the Uyghurs on their own soil. Digital technology pioneered in China and exported around the world is edging us closer towards dystopia. What is happening to the Uyghur people will certainly spread if nothing is done. The OSCE and the international community cannot have an effective or comprehensive security policy without considering the crisis and the crimes against humanity occurring in China. Thank you.
Thank you. Gleiche Möglichkeiten für allen, to be followed by Kazakhstan.
Господин модератор.
Mr. Moderator, distinguished colleagues, Burhakan Sagor, equal opportunities for all. Authoritarian regimes currently enjoy vast powers to clamp down on dissent and civil society. In June of 2014, a journalist from Denmark, Clan Nelson, conducted an interview. The topic was the integration of refugees. One of the turning points of that interview was the following. Ibrahim John is delighted to be in Denmark. However, he fears that one day Uzbek policemen will turn up on his doorstep. And in fact, it was good reason for him to harbor such fears. This man immigrated. He's been in Denmark since 2008 because he saw the Anjan tragedy. He not only witnessed that tragedy, he also saw the aftermath, how it was all brushed under the carpet. So he knows all of the people who worked to clean up the mess. They now hold high-ranking positions in the Uzbek security services. Here he is. Here's his photographs. Our colleagues from Denmark probably know his face very well because the Uzbek security services have not managed to reach him. He's in Europe. Therefore, they decided to harass him via the media. The terrorist attacks which took place in Turkey on New Year's Eve in 2017, you might remember that. So according to the Turkish authorities, he took part in executing those attacks. Representatives of Turkey here, together with their Uzbek colleagues, and also with support from independent media, such as Golov Svobody in Uzbekistan, BBC Uzbekistan, and others, they turned this man into a terrorist in a matter of seconds. Many attempts were made to extradite him to Turkey. The security services tried to do that first. Then they tried to extradite him to Turkey via diplomatic channels, but they did not succeed. However, they have managed to ruin his life because every single person in Denmark believes that he's a terrorist, although he obviously is not. Here I have a document from the Criminal Police Service. It states that he's completely innocent. He was not charged with any crime or any offense for that matter. How do we reverse the tarnishing of his reputation? How do we prevent authoritarian regimes from ruining people's lives via the mass media? His life is in danger. At any moment now, he could be killed. I call on the representatives of Denmark to take up this issue and to find an acceptable solution. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you, Kazakhstan.
Citizen Research and Development Public Union.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, in my statement, I would like to comment on the statements we heard made by Sweden, representing the EU and the Open Dialogue Fund, about the internet blocking practice in Kazakhstan and the supposed limitations on the freedom of speech in Kazakhstan. Our laws state that the internet sites are media, so any measures in limiting access to websites are only used if laws are broken. At the same time, these violations are not only covered by our national laws, but also by international documents. This is linked to the propaganda of terrorism, the propaganda of suicide, pornography, amongst others. So I would like to use this high-level event today and once again reaffirming Kazakhstan's commitment to international human rights and freedom of the media document. Kazakhstan has been very consistent in ensuring the rights of citizens to the freedom of opinion and expression. We have signed the leading documents in the area of freedom of the media. We have an institution in Kazakhstan on the freedom of expression, on processing information, on the media and the work of journalists. The state guarantees for journalists to respect their rights, honor, and professional activities. Recently, the government has done great work on developing a media space for creating the appropriate environment for a dialogue between the government and society, and to include as many people as possible. As a result, today in Kazakhstan, we have registered over 3,500 forms of media outlets. Only in recent years, the number of media has grown more than 10%. And 80% of these are non-state media that represent the linguistic and political variety of the country. In Kazakhstan, we have free, official, the internet radio, Radio Svoboda, working openly, which was mentioned today. Radio Zatik has been officially accredited by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan, and this internet publication works very openly and covers the information presented by the state. We're also elaborating a new draft law and amending the laws on issues of information. Now, this step will help us to further strengthen the rights of citizens in the information sphere and the openness of state bodies, and to boost the competitive aspects of our official media. And we, of course, hope that on all these issues, we will continue to work fruitfully with our European colleagues and partners. Thank you.
Citizen Research and Development Public Union, to be followed by Crimean News Agency.
Thank you very much. My name is Günel Safarova. I am the head of this organization, and my speech is about the real situation of mass media and freedom of speech in Azerbaijan. The current state of the media and freedom of speech can be assessed in several ways. The press is in a poor economical condition, and there is serious difficulty in advertising market, so financial income is almost non-existing. The press is not free because it depends on the government and financed from the state budget. In late 19th, 55% of media market was controlled by independent mass media. Of course, there were pressures at that time too, but nowadays the percentage is just 3%, and independent-minded people are not allowed to broadcast. And it's true that process has begun by public TV, but it is still limited. Also, according to the report, Reporters Without Borders, which includes 180 countries, Azerbaijan is in 166 in the World Press Freedom Index. And nowadays, more than 60 internet sites blocked without any court decision. And it's very interesting that there is no blocking for the articles about the president, but writing from any other ministers or government body result with their punishment. and government must provide convenient environment for the freedom of mass media and journalists. Journalists shouldn't be subjected to pressure or risk for their activity. Khadija Ismail was arrested before and now banned from leaving the country due to her records. Also, Afgan Mukhtarli, journalist, was arrested for 6 years. He is still in prison. And in Azerbaijan, the 75% of population are internet users. There is 100 megabytes of internet in the region. However, the speed of internet is less than 2 megabytes, and it prevents people from receiving visual information, and it limits ability to broadcast lively. So the government should change the legislation regulating the mass media, and it is necessary to abolish the issue of blocking online mass media that recently added to the criminal code. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a request from interpreters that the speakers speak slow, so that slow enough for translation to be made in a concise way, and also as much as possible to the point. Crimean News Agency to be followed by Ossegiena per Informazione.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. My name is Olga Leonova. I live in the Crimea. I've lived there my whole life. For over half my life, I've been a journalist in Crimea. As you may know, our peninsula is often attacked. We're told that information is concealed, that the local authorities, the local people live in fear of speaking out about what's happening in the country. But that is not the case. 5 years ago, I myself witnessed those events, and many of my fellow Crimeans were there as well. We saw that journalists from different countries, different continents, worked in Crimea unimpeded. The Crimean people would like for the world to learn what's actually happening on the peninsula. And what did we actually see? Well, we saw such scenes on the streets that the video cameras of various media outlets, in fact, we had people queuing up to express their opinions, to be interviewed. Millions of photographs collected by various press agencies, and all of those YouTube clips attest to this fact. The Oh Dear logo depicts a tree with lots of eyes. It means that witnesses should not be impeded. In fact, witnessing what's happening in Crimea is very useful. In fact, mass media is very useful for witnesses in Crimea. For instance, you can use social networks to see for yourself what's happening on the peninsula, and very often there are American platforms hosting these channels. Meetings which the authorities hold are streamed live. You can see for yourself how people in Crimea vote, who they're voting for, what's happening on the peninsula. Does peace reign in Crimea? You can look up the weather, you can look up what's going on in society, and you can do this online. This is one of the hallmarks of modern civilization. What else did I want to add? Yet again, I wanted to underscore that we are a world of 1,000 eyes, a world of witnesses, just like on the Oh Dear logo. We, as Crimeans, call on everyone who is not afraid to come to Crimea and to see for yourselves with your own eyes what's happening, our ups and downs, the happy moments, the sad moments. Please, please, I invite you to come to the Crimea. It's not only safe, it's also fascinating. Thank you.
If I may, I would like to draw your attention to the statements by my boss, representative on freedom of the media, made in March 2014 on the situation with the free media in Crimea. Thank you. Next speaker is Ossegiena per l'Informazione, to be followed by Coordination Center for Freedom of Expression.
Here I am. Over the past 10 years, Ossigeno per l'Informazione, Oxygen for Information, has documented and found that threats and intimidations against journalists are frequent and remain unpunished, even in countries based on the rule of law like Italy. Therefore, even in countries based on a democratic system, it is important to establish an efficient monitoring process based on a fact-checking scientific method. It should include 3 or 4 verification steps for each episode of threat and intimidation against journalists who report on the organized crime, but also on other crimes such as corruption, abuses of power, and abuse of office by public officials and politicians. With its monitoring, Ossigeno has helped many journalists to resist the pressure of intimidation and to create conditions for dealing with a problem which is overlooked and often denied in the parliament, in the newsrooms, and in the public opinion. It is necessary to have enough elements to convince the public authorities to perform all their duties in order to guarantee freedom of the press and information. But it is also necessary to frame the Italian case in the European context and to know if other countries also suffer from the same disease. We could know that by subjecting these countries to the analysis of the oxygen method. Is Italy the only country that suffers from this evil that produced a covert censorship and prevents conscious participation in public life? In asking this question, Ossigeno proposes a reflection to the organizations that defend the freedom of expression in other similar countries, to evaluate together the hypothesis to develop surveys that could benefit from Ossigeno's experience. And internationally monitoring requires the production of homogeneous and standard data. In democratic countries, it's easy to believe that serious violation of press freedom only occur elsewhere, in authoritarian regimes or in war-torn areas. We certainly need to ensure better protection to journalists, bloggers, photo and video reporters, citizen journalists in these countries. But reporting of violations that occur in democratic countries is complementary to this campaign, and it is not less important. You find the entire extent of the intervention at the Secretary Office, and together with our latest report, which is called So Much Mafia, So Little News. Thank you.
Thank you, Ossigeno. Coordination Center for Freedom of Expression, to be followed by Uspishna Varta.
Good afternoon. My name is Dmitry Vasilets. I am a journalist. I represent the Center of the Freedom of Expression. Unfortunately, during the Poroshenko regime, I spent 820 days in jail during the Poroshenko years. The thing is that it's very important for this type of event to take place, as we're seeing today. It is an opportunity for journalists and civil society participants to really spread the information with regard to the freedom of expression in Ukraine. Many of my colleagues who have done time in jail, or some who were forced to immigrate for Ukraine not to end up behind bars, are still have cases pending against them. Many are free, but many still are languishing in jail in Ukraine. Here, I would like to present real facts and names. There are some journalists that have gone through prison, and none of them have been cleared of legal responsibility. This is Ruslan Khatstabov, Pavel Volkov. This is the journalist whose name is Muravisky and Skachkov. This includes the head editor of Strandavio, Igor Goshev, as well as Oleg Khavich. In other words, in Ukraine, we have a very sorry state of affairs with regarding to the freedom of expression, in spite of the fact that Poroshenko's regime is a thing of the past and we have new leaders now. We still see a very negative trend. Of course, the situation is much better compared to the past, but what we see today are still clear signals which are alarming for all journalists working in Ukraine. Once again, I want to stress that even if we're talking about Vasily Morawiecki, for a year and a half, he has been under house arrest and has not been able to leave his home because he would be arrested right away. Any journalist who has done time behind bars because of his professional activities, every time has to go to court, be present at trials. If he misses any trial, then he is risking time behind bars. In Ukraine, we also have harassment of journalists who are keeping to journalistic standards. This is the publication called Sharieva, Stranaeva, and the TV channel News One. The open societies of journalists, especially those that are financed through grants, and there have been even cases where the United States government finances them. All of these activists in the media openly call for violence to be waged against other journalists who are keeping to journalistic standards. Also, our journalists are not allowed to have access to polling stations of Ukrainian polling stations abroad. I will give the full text of my statement to the Secretariat.
Спасибо. Успешна Варта, to be followed by Slovenia.
Здравствуйте, это я.
Good afternoon. My name is Ruslan Kasava. I'm also a former prisoner of conscience. According to Amnesty International, I spent a long time in prison because I called for economic problems to be resolved by non-military means. Also, I was on the front lines reporting the bitter truth about the civilian conflict in the Donbass. And I called and still call on an end to the draft as a non-democratic measure, in the Ukraine, that is. I continue to convince that the Poroshenko regime might be held accountable to what happened whilst he was in power, the genocide, in fact. Let me say a few words about what's happening in Ukraine. Well, we've had a change in leadership. The president enjoys popular support. The Verkhovna Rada has been renewed, and what we've seen is that power has been usurped in the positive sense of the word, and reforms are afoot. Reforms are afoot for the journalistic community and for everyone else in the room, for human rights defenders, for organizations defending human rights. What we've seen is that the Ukrainian authorities want to shut down News One and two other TV channels, Ustavinatsiya Ukraina and Zik, these three opposition channels. When it comes to News One, what I can say is that a week ago, in fact, the relevant regulatory body called on a court to revoke the license of that broadcaster. And today, in fact, the court rejected the rationale for prolonging the license of the second news outlet I referred to, so it might have its license revoked very soon. And as for Zik, that news channel, in fact, the regulator conducted a surprise visit to that news channel, and let's see what that results in. So all three TV channels have experienced a clampdown. This happened under the current government and also under the previous government to some extent. So I call on everyone to draw attention to the situation and to put an end to the clampdown on the freedom of expression, the clampdown on journalists and opposition TV channels. It's practically the heart of Europe, and yet grenades are being thrown. That's not acceptable. Furthermore, neo-Nazis are used to block the work of TV channels, and in fact some of these neo-Nazi groups are being funded out of the government budget. It's also unacceptable that journalists are being killed. Furthermore, it's inadmissible that the guilty have not been identified.
By Crimea SOS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Let me just add some elements in my national capacity additional to what we have expressed in the statement delivered by the European Union. First, we would like to commend the representative on freedom of the media, Mr. Harlem Desir, and his team for their work and efforts in advocating media freedom throughout the OSCE area. The institution of OSCE representative on freedom of the media has an invaluable role in promoting and protecting the media freedom standards and commitments in the OSCE area. It is therefore crucial to preserve intact the mandate of the institution and ensure its independence. Freedom of expression is an open space, not only for media, but also for the whole societies. Free flow of information empowers people and raises awareness about the whole area of issues in politics, economy, and society in general, or certain issues that would be otherwise neglected or ignored. Shortcomings in the implementation of universally accepted international standards and norms can often be identified at the national level. Often, domestic legal framework is not in line with international legal obligations. We have to ensure a full respect for freedom of expression as outlined in Articles 19 and 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We would also like to highlight the importance of the Ministerial Council decision on safety of journalists adopted in December 2018 that calls on the OSCE participating states, and I quote, to take effective measures to end impunity for crimes committed against journalists by ensuring accountability as a key element in preventing future attack, end of quote. Finally, let me inform that Slovenian government is currently working on a new media act which seeks to preserve quality journalism at a time when clickability underlies many business models. The draft act is adapted to the new digital media reality and includes provisions to counter hate speech and false news. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you very much, especially for the kind words about our team. Crimea SOS, to be followed by the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Меня зовут...
My name is Damla Kasheva. I'm a coordinator of the Crimsos organization. Starting from 2014, after the military aggression to capture Crimea and the illegal occupation of the peninsula from Crimea due to the harassment of independent journalists, many independent journalists had to leave Crimea and go to Ukraine, and entire companies had to leave. The Center for Journalistic Investigation, the Terror Holding, and Radio Maidan broadcasters had to leave. Russia has full control over Crimea. They have an imitation of the freedom of expression. They have a information simulacra where journalists, activists, and defenders and lawyers that are dealing with politically motivated cases are called devil's advocates. Russia has created a situation where independent civil journalists cannot work. Nikolai Simina had to spend 2 years, was sentenced to 2 years in prison, where he has to stay in Ukraine and in Crimea and not have the right to leave the country because he wrote that Crimea was the victim of occupation and illegal capture. I would like to point your attention to the fact that they're calling for independent journalists to come to Crimea. Why is it that Alina Smukhko, after having covered the cases and trials against Crimean Tatars, were banned access to the Crimea for 10 years? Why is it that Kilka Korny, Anna Drevska, journalists, have also been sued in Crimea? Atira Mishailova has been sentenced in absentia, and now she is being sought internationally. The real source and only source of information in Crimea now are citizen journalists who tell the truth about what is happening here. My so-called colleagues from Crimea said today that this is a good opportunity to tell the truth. Well, I am appealing to delegations and independent journalists. I appeal you to go to the website of Crimean Solidarity, where you can really read about the realities in Crimea, where human rights defenders and real journalists are being sentenced to 10 to 20 years behind bars. And my last idea today that I want to get across to you today, the Russian propaganda journalists, please don't try to use the name of Ablat Sheremet, a great Ukrainian and Russian journalist. Thank you.
Assembly of the OSCE, to be followed by Legal Media Center.
Thank you for having me here today. It is an honor to represent the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and to speak on this critical topic. Challenges to freedom of expression come in many forms. Some are highly visible. Journalists face pressure for governments and threats from organized crime. They endure violence and sometimes face prison time. Indeed, we know that in the OSCE area there are numerous journalists who are in prison at this moment simply for doing their jobs. As OSCE parliamentarians who rely on journalists and other forms of media for our work, we are very concerned about the persecution of journalists and aggressive rhetoric against their work. A robust and independent media is a central pillar of a stable society. In recognition of the particular importance and sensitivity in this field, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly recently called for parliamentary oversight of governments' action towards all cases of journalist murders, imprisonment, or ill treatment. We hope that officials in this room will also take note of our call for OSCE participating states to develop strategies to eliminate the harassment of women journalists who we know are disproportionately attacked both online and offline due to their gender. In addition, in our most recent declaration, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly made it clear that efforts to protect journalists should not be limited to those formally recognized and documented as such, but should also cover support staff, citizen journalists, bloggers, and other active in this field. Simply to say, OSCE participating states have committed to respect the freedom of expression. This means freedom for all, not just those who have a formal accreditation card or who hold an opinion that is convenient to the government. But censorship and intimidation are only the most visible of the many challenges faced by journalists and only the tip of the iceberg in terms of current threats to freedom of expression. In reality, there are numerous pressures that inhibit true freedom of expression, including financial and political pressures, self-censorship, and a dilution of traditional standards in the journalist profession. Today, Internet access is close to 100% in some OSCE countries, so we have untold amounts of information at our fingertips. But we also all know that we have untold amounts of disinformation at our fingertips. Information technology is being abused, and we have all seen public debates being polarized and public opinion influenced as a result of fake news invading the media environment. The manufacturing and marketing of false information we are witnessing today, notably through the development of troll factories, instrumentalize fake news. While this may be a form of freedom of expression, it can seriously endanger democracy and its core values.
So
However,
time is out. I'm sorry.
Just a moment, please. However, in addressing fake news, we must not curb the freedom of expression on which our democratic systems rely. We cannot go down the road of creating a broad category of people and outlets which could be automatically censored. Targeted efforts must be deployed to counter fake news through enhancing transparency, enabling easy and immediate access to reliable information for citizens and restore free and independent journalism as a central source of high quality and reliable information. This can create the grounds of functioning participatory democracies through an informed population. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Legal Media Center, to be followed by School of Peacemaking and Media Technology in Central Asia.
Good afternoon. I'm here representing an organization from Kazakhstan which works to protect journalism and also works on information access issues. I want to focus on two issues. First of all, the fact that journalists cannot perform their professional duties at various demonstrations. Over the last few months, over 10 journalists were detained, one was gassed, and in fact the police completely ignored this. This is a very dangerous trend, as journalists in Kazakhstan do not enjoy any kind of immunity, any kind of guarantees that their rights will be upheld, and the law enforcement authorities, instead of responding, they in fact behave in such a way as to show that journalists have no rights. That's the first thing. Second of all, access to information. Over the last dozen or so years, 15 years, this is the most serious problem that's come to the fore in Kazakhstan journalism circles. The ministry responsible for information access, so the relevant body, needs to start working in a more transparent fashion. Unfortunately, it hasn't been doing that. It has now claimed that information about budget spending is secret, confidential information. What we've seen is other state bodies repeating and going in the same footsteps. And the State Audit Chamber is now also restricting access to budgetary information about its spending. Not only do citizens have the right to access that information, but it's also one of the pillars of international anti-corruption efforts. Kazakhstan is trying to become a member of the OSCE, to the Open Government Initiative, to join that initiative. However, all of the courts in Kazakhstan, including the Supreme Court, have upheld the Ministry of Information decision, according to which budgetary spending information, budget information, should be kept confidential. It should be secret. A note of optimism amongst the gloom. The punishment handed down for libel has been loosened. It's now less stringent. And in fact, as was mentioned by one of the speakers before me, there might be further grounds for optimism in the near future.
Making and Media Technology in Central Asia, to be followed by Center for Civil Liberties.
Good afternoon. I represent the School for Peacemaking in Central Asia. We deal with monitoring and researching freedom of expression in all 5 countries, as well as in the promotion of variety in society. I wanted to speak about the main risks that the freedom of expression is standing up to in Central Asia. The main problem is that the freedom of expression in Central Asia of today is criminalized. And this is the main threat to its implementation. Authorities use many instruments. First of all, the repressive laws and the so-called unconvincing anti-extremism. Anti-extremist laws, these countries of CSTO, through the bloc of Kremlin, use sanctions that put down the freedom of expression by using different mechanisms. Any public statement on a topic which is not approved of in Central Asia could lead to these sanctions, and people can be charged with anti-extremist laws. In many countries, and most often in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there are also forms of humanitarian assessments which are being used in order to assess disputable media content linked to a specific statement. And quite often, these are used by the courts to charge people, and are used by the states who initiate these cases against individuals. Also, some films are banned because they also are contrary to official lines of certain Central Asian countries. In Uzbekistan, for example, they have such banned films. Anti-extremist sanctions can also be applied not only against journalists, but against bloggers and human rights defenders. For example, to alternative reports to the UN. This was a case in Uzbekistan when the banned materials were put on a list that was on the same level as ISIS, for example. And then rights defenders had to deal with that. Also, the excessive interpretation on the laws against hate speech in Central Asia, where there's a very clear difference between hate speech and possible uses of freedom of expression. So all of these different interpretations in instigating strife is used by the governments to harass journalists and the freedom of expression. Also, the fact that the media is quite homogeneous and also pertains to the rights of national minorities. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, after violence, minority media sources were liquidated, and they still have not been reestablished, and the Uzbek minorities do not have access to information. I do have a recommendation, if I may, but I will give them to the Secretariat on these specific items. Thank you very much.
Center for Civil Liberties to be followed by International Partnership for Human Rights, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Gumin Jalili. I'm from Crimea. I'm a lawyer. One of the people I have been representing is the coordinator of the Civil Society Association, Crimean Solidarity, Shepmester 5. Now, this movement brings together the relatives of those being prosecuted on religious or other similar grounds. For instance, citizen journalists, human rights defenders, documentary filmmakers, and all of those who care. Now, this movement works in 3 different areas. First of all, legal assistance to those whose rights have been violated. Second of all, putting human rights violations in the spotlight, documenting them, and then assistance to the families who've lost a breadwinner because of the prosecution. Severin Mustafayev was one of the people behind the founding of Crimean Solidarity, that movement, and he is a prominent citizen journalist and documentary filmmaker in Crimea. In 2018, because of psychological pressure, because he was being forced to flee Crimea, he was arrested. He was accused of engaging in terrorist activities and seeking to overthrow the government in the Russian Federation. He is facing 20 years in prison. Now, what is the evidence pointing to the fact that he was implicated in terrorist activities and attempting to seize power? Well, in fact, Mr. Mustafayev was once in a mosque. He was attending a lecture with other worshippers, and he asked a question. This question was enough for him to be charged with 2 serious crimes. So he didn't take part in plotting any coup, he didn't kill anyone, but he is being prosecuted now. The counterterrorism legislation in the Russian Federation is being used as a tool to prosecute and crack down on dissenters. Dozens of Crimean Tatars have now been portrayed in the media wearing terrorist paraphernalia. This has nothing to do with terrorism, in fact. It has nothing to do with security. Over 63 Crimean Tatars have been prosecuted under terrorism offenses. 200 children have lost their breadwinners. Whole families have been destroyed, and some of these people have been sentenced to 15 to 17 years. Mr. Mustafayev, one of the founders of the citizen journalism movement in Crimea, a source of independent information coming out of Crimea, wrote that even prison won't stand in the way of him and fellow Crimean citizens. Every person in his heart and mind needs to fight for freedom. Our strength lies in our united efforts. That's how we have hope that we'll triumph. Therefore, I call on everyone who cares to join us.
International Partnership for Human Rights, to be followed by Liechtenstein.
Good afternoon, participants. My name is Aider Zamatov. I am a lawyer from Crimea. I represent people, the most of whom are citizens of Ukraine. Crimean Tatars live in Crimea, who are political prisoners. I'm a lawyer also of one of the Ukrainian sailors who were prisoners of war and recently liberated. I would like to list a number of people who in Crimea are being persecuted for their activities, civil situation. Aldin Gatamitov, Aidar, all of these people are volunteers and activists who were arrested and are also political prisoners. Kalin Wataza and Sulman Watamirov participated in Crimean Solidarity Movement, who are regularly pressured by the Russian security services. For their activities, these people were arrested and are being charged with terrorism and attempts to topple the power in Russia. This is, of course, not true, because the whole aim of what is being done is to hush them up and to gag them. None of them prepared terrorist attacks or had guns or tried to topple the authorities in Crimea. They were journalists and they were trying to do their jobs. All of these people were uncomfortable for the authorities, and they were trying to cover the political trials that were taking place, and they picketed during these trials of journalists by Russian security services. Each one is is facing 1 to 10 years of prison only because they were standing up for the freedom of expression and freedom of religion. All of these people, in a line with the European Parliament, were acknowledged to be political prisoners, prisoners of conscience. They were just covering the trials in Crimea. Basically, they are now taking the place of free media who, after 2014, had to leave Crimea. Today, these people are being harassed and prosecuted only because they are covering the events in Crimea. Yes, there are many different media and publications in Crimea. Somehow, these Crimea do not cover the trials that are charging Crimean Tatars, who are citizens of Ukraine and who are wholesale being accused of terrorism. Imagine yourselves in these people's shoes just for a minute. Imagine just for a second that you may be charged with terrorism only because of the religion that you practice. You want to freely express your own opinion. You want to freely cover the events that are taking place in the territory where you live. I would like you to imagine today and to decide for yourselves today, not as a statement, but in practice, to do this. Thank you.
Liechtenstein, to be followed by Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Freedom of expression, free media, and information are indispensable guarantees in functioning rule of law abiding democracies. With the popularization of the Internet, these rights have taken on an entirely new dimension for citizens and the media alike. Ensuring their full and equal access to non-discriminatory Internet services should be an utmost priority for all OSCE participating states. Nonetheless, the uncurtailed exercise of the right by some members of society may also result in the inhibition of its exercise by others. This is particularly the case if hate speech is used to intimidate certain social groups and minorities or attack opposition politicians or parties. It is for states to strike the right balance between guaranteeing free speech rights on the one hand and preventing hate speech and discrimination on the other. In recent years, Liechtenstein newspapers received an increasing amount of letters to the editor and comments online involving discriminatory speech against social groups such as Muslims, refugees, migrants, or LGBTI persons. Based on reports of Liechtenstein's civil society, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance issued the recommendation that Liechtenstein's authorities should support the national media in their response to hate speech. To implement the recommendation, the government's Violence Protection Commission initiated an open dialogue with the Liechtenstein media and organized a workshop with the director of projects of the International Network Against Cyber Hate. The dialogue and workshop aimed at supporting Liechtenstein journalists in identifying and adequately responding to hate speech addressed against vulnerable groups or against journalists themselves. The project resulted in a better understanding of the Liechtenstein media, of how to detect and address hate speech online as well as offline. It therefore contributes to the fostering of a civilized and tolerant public discourse in Liechtenstein, which provides room for differing opinions free from discrimination and that does not silence minority or critical voices. Ensuring such a discourse seems to be an ever-important obligation of OSCE participating states in the light of shrinking spaces for civil society actors and human rights defenders and increasing nationalist and populist public discourse directed against vulnerable groups. We're happy to share more information on Liechtenstein's collaboration with the media on hate speech bilaterally. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We have at this point 7 delegations who requested a right of reply. If there are any more, please register with ADIR. And because of that, I also request all other future participants in the discussion to impose on themselves self-censorship and speak strictly below 3 minutes. Azerbaijan to be followed by Azerbaijan Press Council.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give some information about the freedom of express media information in Azerbaijan in reality, and also make short notes on the issues raised here. Azerbaijan authorities consider ensuring freedom of speech and press media development one of the main directions of the state policy. At the present, more than 5,000 media are officially registered in Azerbaijan. By the number of media, Azerbaijan is one of the leaders in CIS and Eastern Europe. More than 50 journalistic organizations are registered in Azerbaijan. About 30 organizations are actively involved in strengthening freedom of speech and information. Economic independence of the press, protecting the rights of journalists, regulating relations between society and the media, and other issues. The number of independent commercial companies that distribute printed matter reached 23. Now in our country, more than 80% of the population are internet users. The number of websites registered on the AZ domain exceeds 2,000. The freedom of speech and information is ensured in Azerbaijan. A regulatory and legal basis has been developed based on the international standards. Hundreds of media outlets act freely. Therefore, it is wrong to express concern about the freedom of press in Azerbaijan, as EU delegation raised it here, and also one NGO coming from Azerbaijan. To talk about the closure of the media contradicts the existing reality. There is no restrictions. The recirculation of information has been restricted by the court, according to the article, according to the Internet Information Resource Law, Article 13. Exercise of the right to freedom of expression carries with its special duties and responsibilities. Journalists must strictly follow laws and regulations, including appropriate accreditation procedures, especially when it concerns so-called separatist regime. It's warranted by the security situation. States can apply travel restrictions to certain areas within its territory affected by conflicts, which is in full conformity with national laws and relevant provisions of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including those prescribed in Article 19. If media representatives fail to respect national legislation of the host country, international norms and standards that also is a part of democratic values, then we have every reason to question objectivity, which turn into a tool to incite violence and violation of international law, foment tension, and promote situation created through unlawful use of force. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Azerbaijan Press Council to be followed by Union of Informed Citizens.
Thank you, Andre. My name is Azura Svet. I represent the Press Council of Azerbaijan. I will do my very best to keep my comments brief. I'll speak to a couple of points. First of all, the Azerbaijani Press Council is the organization tasked with mediating, if you will, between unhappy mass media between people who are unhappy with the behavior of certain media outlet and the journalists. The Press Council very often rules in favor of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, in favor of the journalists. And many people are, of course, pleased about that, including the journalists. Sometimes also people who lodge complaints. Now, some people mentioned websites being blocked in Azerbaijan. Let's tread very carefully here. For the most part, these are extremist organization websites, or it's content put up there by extremist individuals, supported by a neighboring country, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and people from similar circles, those who want to see an Iranian-style regime in Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani people don't want that. That's why I'm in favor of blocking websites disseminating these views. We also want to take down content posted by pseudo-journalists disseminating extremist ideas. Furthermore, many have spoken about the freedom of expression. However, I've heard very little about responsibility, accountability. Now, if we're journalists, that doesn't mean that we have the right to say anything we like, left, right, and center, without being held accountable for the views we disseminate. Also, a question was asked regarding Radio Freedom, Radio Svoboda, journalists in a number of countries. I think we need to resolve this issue with the involvement of the United States of America. After all, this radio was set up in the aftermath of World War II, during the Cold War, and we all know that this is a propaganda mass media outlet. Therefore, we believe that the United States of America should shut this radio station down. At the same time, I should like to mention that this radio, you can't listen to it in the United States of America itself. I hope that tomorrow I will have time to make additional comments and recommendations. Thank you.
Union of Informed Citizens, to be followed by Mr. Karimov.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, we're all witnessed the rise of anti-democratic propaganda, both in Armenia and in other OSCE member states. Through various means of propaganda in different countries, Russia is either trying to increase the influence of anti-democratic forces and even to provocate the authorities for anti-democratic actions. We see this in European countries, in post-Soviet countries and other parts of the world. Following the revolution in Armenia in 2018, we have witnessed elimination of media monopoly and liberalization of television. This purely positive change, however, was soon used by pro-Russian and anti-democratic forces to mobilize large media resources and began to carry out anti-democratic propaganda very actively. I cannot say that I welcome all steps taken by Armenian authorities to ensure freedom of speech, but what Russia is doing must be countered by everyone who supports democratic values around the world. Only by joint offers we can have fruitful protection of our values. Obviously, this counteraction cannot be a counter-propaganda in the same quality. Moreover, it cannot be expressed by a censorship. This counter-action should be democratic in its nature and should be comprised of short, mid, and long-term activities. Particularly, in short-term, communication capacities of democracy supporters and fact-checking needs to be increased. In mid-term, the promotion of independent media and media literacy among the wide cycles of society should be encouraged. In long term, it is necessary to raise the level of education of wide society, and particularly critical thinking. Such the sociological research we have done in Armenia has shown a clear correlation between education, between the level of education, media literacy, and the support of democracy or democratic values. I believe it's the same in any other country. There is no other way to protect democratic values in the OSCE region, but to bring these actions into life. If actions are not taken to fulfill these steps now, it may be late in several years, because Russia and few other member states are very actively working for an opposite purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Karimov, freelance journalist, to be followed by Politeconomy Institute of Political, Economic and Legal Studies.
Thank you very much. I am Seymur Kazimov, freelance journalist in Azerbaijan. As my colleague has already pointed out, the fundamental issues with the media, of course, I do not touch the issues. I'm trying to save the time, but I will add something on my own. There were some changes to legislation that affected the capability of media to be diverse and meet the needs of journalists. The freedom of media was influenced negatively, especially by the amendments of July 2012, which increased the closure of information on corporate entities. Specifically, the changes limited public access to information about the ownership of commercial entities, including their capital, structure of ownership. While waiting for the adoption of law on defamation, on May 12/13, the criminal code was amended. The definition of slander specified in Article 147 of the code was broadened by adding the following words: in a mass media outlet or in the internet information resource when displayed publicly. Again, while waiting for the adoption of law on defamation, on November 2016, a new article was added to criminal code, which determines responsibility for online slander or insult by using fake usernames, profiles, or accounts. In March 2017, Azerbaijani's law on dissemination and protection of information was amended to provide a legal basis for blocking online resources. The measure also gave the Minister of Transport, Communication and High Technologies the power to shut down an internet outlet without a court order. But according to law, mass media, Article 7, there is no censorship in Azerbaijan. There is no press ombudsman that may function as a separate institution in Azerbaijan. A provision in the Access to Information Law of 2005 required the establishment of an information commissioner. Yet, the amendments 2010 to the constitutional law on the Human Rights Commissioner passed these duties to the Human Rights Commissioner or Ombudsman. I have just received a question from Leyla Mustafayeva. She is wife of Afgan Muhtarlı. She asked me for asking question to Georgian representative here. Why the Chief Prosecutor's Office of Georgia has not released the findings of the investigation on Afgan Muhtarlı case till today?
Thank you.
Reminder, 2 years and 4 months have already passed since he was kidnapped in Georgia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Politeconomy Institute of Political, Economic and Legal Studies, to be followed by the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Мое выступление
I will be speaking on the government transition and the role of social media
Of expression, freedom of the media.
и свободы информации.
and the freedom of expression and freedom of the press in this process. The freedom of the press and the freedom of social networks were topics without which in 2018 18 in Armenia, it would have been impossible to provide for the power transition, which was also known as the Velvet Revolution of Armenia. For many years, social platforms and media were platforms that channeled the social demand for the transformation in society. Society also demanded transformations that would ensure the significant improvement of the quality of life. The previous political elites did not want or could not affect these changes. This is because the government did not heed the demands of the people, and people had to go out into the streets and to build their future using their own hands. At that time, social networks and media played a crucial role by transmitting live the demands and actions of the population. But we also need to combat for the future, and so that the social networks and the media after the revolution should not only reduce their importance, but to boost their significance with regard to government oversight, so that the governments and the leadership should strictly remain with the goal, the demands of the peoples in mind. The OSCE can play an important role here, that has already played an important constructive role in this process, and in helping with one of the most important issues that is linked to the imprisonment of the owner of the second TV channel in Armenia, who is having serious health problems. This person was let out of jail thanks to the efforts of the OSCE, and he was in prison only because he had very close links to the representatives of one of the representatives of the former authorities, the former president. Together with the revolutions taking place in our area, there's also an evolutionary change of power, where the internet and social networks also played an important role. This is a transition of power in Kazakhstan with regard to the consolidation of political elites, who in that country could be an example for other countries. A transition of power took place there, but at the time in Kazakhstan, processes got underway which changed the information environment and the social networks.
America to be followed by public organization Human Rights of Crimea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having listened to all of the statements through the day, the United States wishes to make its position clear. When freedom of expression is under attack, the whole of society suffers. Journalists lose their ability to hold officials and institutions accountable. Freedom of expression and access to media are unduly limited in many OSCE participating states through excessively restrictive laws, political actions, technological measures, and economic pressure. Use of the law to intimidate journalists, including through fines and imprisonment, is probably the most rampant form of restriction, leading to censorship and self-censorship out of intimidation. OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Harlem Desir, raised 121 individual cases of journalists in detention and imprisonment in the OSCE region in the last reporting period. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, Turkey jails more professional journalists than any other country in the world. Since the 2016 failed coup attempt, nearly 200 media outlets have been closed and dozens of journalists jailed. Some online content and media outlets have been blocked. The United States recognizes the particular security challenges that Turkey perceives, but silencing critical voices is not the answer. In December 18 report, the Committee to Protect Journalists ranked Azerbaijan as the OSCE's region's second largest jailer of journalists. Discussion about prohibiting foreign media outlets such as U.S.-based Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty has been addressed in this meeting, from operating in Azerbaijan and other places and blocking independent media sites. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty is a private, nonprofit corporation. U.S. law prohibits interference by U.S. government officials in the objective and independent reporting of news by Radio Free Liberty, Radio Liberty, and Radio Free Europe, and they are no propaganda device, as has been suggested. In addition to journalists, Turkish and authorities have incarcerated opposition figures and others for exercising their fundamental rights. In Russia, the government is increasing its efforts to censor speech online by banning expressions of disrespect for state or government officials and prohibiting the dissemination of information the government deems untrue. The 217 expansion of Russia's foreign agent law unfairly targets Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Liberty with overburdensome regulatory requirements.
Please conclude.
Here is truth, Mr. Moderator. Free expression is no threat to freely elected governments. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. Human rights of Crimea to be followed by Ukraine.
Damir Minadirov. I'm from a civil society organization, the Human Rights Defenders Movement in Crimea. After the occupation of Crimea in 2014, the Crimean Tatar people were subjected to repression exacted by the Russian Federation. Roughly 70 Crimean Tatars have been convicted, or their cases are currently pending because they've been charged with terrorism. This is how they're trying to crack down on dissent. As you may recall, the Crimean Tatars were not okay with the occupation. A campaign was launched in 2014 to clamp down on independent media. Colleagues have listed all of the offences. I won't repeat what they said. At the same time, the Citizen Journalism Institute was set up. Its members began using social media to publish their reporting. These were photographs from courtrooms where Crimean Tatar cases were being discussed, interviews with those who law enforcement officials had somehow intimidated. All of the pressure that was exerted on these journalists did not stop them. They continued doing this work. Thus, the citizen journalism became basically the sole source of independent information in Crimea. Crimean Solidarity is one of the organizations bringing together the citizen journalists and bloggers. For instance, Marivan Malibidru. He is one of the founding fathers of citizen journalism in Crimea. He has reported on political cases being considered by the courts on numerous occasions. In 2015, his house was searched and banned literature was planted at his home. His wife noticed, and the case against him did not hold water. It fell to pieces. Other activists, Mr. Fayev in Bakhchisarai, was also facing persecution. He supposedly took part in an unsanctioned demonstration. He received threats. When he was detained, many international organizations came to his defense, human rights defenders, journalists, and many others. By way of conclusion, I want to quote the words of the OSCE High Representative on the Freedom of the Media, Halim Jazir. He condemned the persecution of independent journalists in Crimea. He called for them to be freed. Thus, we call on the Russian Federation and the occupation government in Crimea to put an end to the persecution of the citizen journalist and activist, the representative of Crimean Solidarity, and to release him. We also call for an independent investigation into his unlawful detention. We call for a dispassionate investigation into all of the violence that's been wielded against citizen journalists in Crimea so as to hold all the perpetrators to account. We call on human rights defenders and journalists to put these criminal proceedings in the spotlight, because if the Russian Federation tramples citizen journalism in Crimea, we won't have any more sources of independent information.
My apologies. I have to limit the rest of speakers to 2 minutes. Thank you for understanding. Ukraine is next. And to be followed by Turkmenistan.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, just a couple of days ago in Kyiv at the 16th annual meeting of Yalta European Strategy, we talked about the crisis of democratic model. And one of the brightest minds of our time, philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy noted that previous crises of liberal democratic institutions occurred in the first half of 20th century, and both led to world wars. At the same time, we talked about the fact that after 1945, that is 75 years, in Europe and in the world there were no major protracted bloody wars, and we saw the victory of world diplomacy in this. I work in the field of information, and unfortunately I must note that the information war never ended. It only intensified with the development of technologies. In addition, I'm a citizen of Ukraine, and I should admit that protracted and bloody wars are taking place. One is happening right now in Ukraine. During 5 years, we have lost 13,000 lives. I want to express my thanks to Minister Jacek Chaputovich, who mentioned this right on the very first minutes of our meeting. And it's easy to understand who opposes Ukraine in this war. 35 captured earlier Ukrainian citizens returned 2 days ago to Kyiv by flight from Vnukovo airport near Moscow. But back to information. Almost immediately after the seizure of power department buildings in Donetsk in April 2014, TV signal transmitters were retuned, and another signal appeared on frequency of local state television company. Yeah, it was not Euronews, not BBC, not CNN. Channel Russia 24 appeared on the air. In a few days, all Ukrainian TV channels that were broadcasting from the highest TV tower in the Donetsk region were replaced by channels from Russian Federation. This occurred in the same manner as in Crimea just 2 months earlier in February and March 2014. So I should say that as far as this territory is now covered by broadcasters which are not under the control of National Council of Ukraine of television and radio broadcasting, we cannot talk about their compliance with fundamental freedoms. Cable networks switched off Ukrainian channels as well during the same 2 weeks in April-May 2014. While the level of freedom of speech and expression on the highest level ever in Ukraine, we can only state that Ukrainian citizens who live in territory of annexed Crimea and in the east of Ukraine have been deprived of right of free access to information and cannot get acquainted with the position of Ukrainian state and the opinions of their fellow citizens in unprepared form for 5 years now. Thank you.
Thank you. Turkmenistan to be followed by Set My People Free.
In line with the policies enacted by Turkmenistan on the promoting of the media and creating new electronic, digital, and print media, broadening access on the internet, establishing relations with foreign media, we are very much involved in promoting all of these in Turkmenistan. Constitution and standards with regard to the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, protecting journalists are protected by the guarantees of law of Turkmenistan on the media and on the internet and internet services in Turkmenistan, amongst other laws. It must be noted that the legal standards for the internet in Turkmenistan do not introduce any limitations on the use of internet site, except for those that are banned under law and that are used for propaganda of terrorist and radical activities. The number of internet users using mobile as well as fixed networks is 2.5 million people. We have over 180 various internet sites and portals in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has had long-standing cooperation with the Ashgabat Center in Ashgabat with regard to improving the qualifications for media workers and in exchanging experience. In the area of human rights, we have held a number of activities. For example, from May to June of 2019, seminars were conducted on reforming our laws on the media in the area of digital technology, modernizing the television in the 21st century, seminars and courses on the coverage of political and humanitarian issues, and working with online media. There were roundtable meetings with representatives of parliamentarians key media and agencies involved in legislation reform on the media. This was an opportunity to discuss the future development and upgrading of our laws and introducing reforms on the media. And also for the managers of the State Committee of Turkmenistan on television and radio broadcasting. Also this year, in Bishkek, we held the 21st Central Asian Conference on the Freedom of the Media, which included delegations from our country, official delegations, and representatives of independent media. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Free to be followed by cessation of Tajik use in the Russian Federation.
It is wonderful again to discuss the issue of freedom of expression. And a couple of years back, the democratic countries, they protected freedom of press. And you go to the bookshop, you can choose the book you want to read. You can go and buy the newspaper you like. Some newspapers you didn't like. Some you thought they are really corrupt and liars. Some others are good. You chose some certain newspaper to read and decided to read them. Others you didn't like to read them. But there was protection for freedom of expression. But I'm surprised today there is a big row against the internet, against Facebook. I mean, we are mature. We decide what to listen to, what to read. We cannot have the same narrative, all of us. So there is some laws which protected us during the when we didn't have internet. The same laws can be applied today. We don't have to make a big row. I don't think we are children whom we can be manipulated, but we have to really believe in diversity and not only one narrative, because if you have only one narrative, then it is a propaganda. So we have to discuss, and I think censorship is not the answer for this problem. Actually, more freedom of expression, more discussion, bringing the truth out, because the truth will always win. And so we have to talk about the issue. And so my recommendation, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and import information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers, even in Facebook and Twitter.
Thank you for your speech and your quote. A cessation of Tajik use in the Russian Federation is the last but not the least, of course.
Thank you, moderator. The freedom of expression, access to information, they are the founding principles of a free and open democratic society, which recognizes the rights of its citizens and the rule of law. The freedom of the media in Tajikistan is of particular importance. The freedom of expression is guaranteed by our constitution. It's worth noting that since it became independent, our country has made great strides. We have many more media outlets, and there are many more independent media outlets than there are state-owned ones or state-controlled ones. 66, we have many media outlets, over 500 are non-state and over 100 are state-owned. In 2012, when we marked the 100-year anniversaries of Tajikistani journalism, we noted that this is one of the main factors, that free press is one of the main factors helping the development of society. Criticism needs to be underpinned by serious analysis, fact-checked analysis. In fact, the government is well aware of the power and the importance of journalism. Therefore, the government listens to journalists as representatives of civil society. The government takes freedom of expression and access to information very seriously. Evidence of this can be found in the fact that Deutsche Welle, Sputnik, BBC, and other media outlets, foreign media outlets, are allowed to operate in the country. In fact, all views are reflected in the media reporting in Tajikistan. Unfortunately, on the internet, we have seen many pseudo-media outlets pop up. This is basically the
yellow press, the so-called yellow press. Therefore, I think it's important to raise such salient issues as the quality of information at a time when there's a lot of fake news going around, a lot of disinformation, at a time when one out of two people is a self-proclaimed journalism. We cannot, of course, always fact-check the information being put to us. Therefore, we need to come up with some kind of strategy containing recommendations for OSCE participating states, telling them how they can combat fake news and disinformation. Thank you.
We almost conclude our discussion. We have 16 right of replies. And I would give 1 minute to each delegation because of the time. As you can see, it's 6 minutes to 6. And we have some other things to discuss at the end. Thank you very much. The first is Tajikistan, to be followed by France.
Ladies and gentlemen, as some representatives from civil society who spoke today under various titles touched upon the situation with regard to the freedom of the media in Tajikistan have been baseless. This is why we would like to say the following. With regard to criminal proceedings for likes in the media, under our laws, any like or repost or exchange of information, even if this information is extremist, is considered to be extremist. Now, this is absolutely false. This does not exist. Extremist publications and repost cannot be proof of the committing of a crime. The character and the extent of the public threat of these publications is assessed. Also, activities which are formally under the penal code but which are not dangerous to the public are also not used to charge people. No one is held liable for expressing their opinion or participating in anything. Using the information about freedom of the media will be presented at our next session and presented to the Secretariat. Please do not abuse your presence here as a way of spreading false information. Thank you.
Followed by Lithuania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to exercise our right of reply in response to the statement made by the Russian Federation and also the statement by Russia Today. France has fully upheld its commitments on the freedom of expression. We are attached to pluralism and press freedom. We abhor the fact that they were put in doubt. These are pillars of any constitutional democracy. Citizens must be able to base their opinions on reliable information. The freedom of information should not be confused with the freedom to spread disinformation. The French Audiovisual Council, an independent state body, has sanctioned some Russian media outlets working in France because they, and I quote, were behaving in a dishonest way. They were not disseminating the existing diversity of views either. We condemn this. Against this backdrop, attempts to uphold the quality of information are absolutely legitimate, and we welcome the adoption, and this is a Reporters Without Borders initiative, the adoption of the International Declaration on Information and Democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lithuania, followed by Kazakhstan.
Thank you. I would like to use my right of reply on the case of entry-ban of the editor for Sputnik Lithuania, Marat Kasem, at Vilnius Airport in June. So I would like to mention that respective Lithuanian authorities took a decision in case of Marat Kasem in full compliance with national and EU law and international commitments. Marat Kasem has the right to appeal this decision. Now, as relates the decision to limit access to the portal of the Russian state-controlled news agency Sputnik, it was taken due to violation of Lithuanian laws on data protection. Sputnik placed on its portal more than 1,000 articles without the permission of the authors. Sputnik has been asked to remove the content. However, despite several warnings issued by Radio and Television Commission, it has not taken any action. Therefore, the access to the portal was limited by the court decision. Only when the above-mentioned illegally used content was removed, the access to the portal was re-established.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Kazakhstan, followed by Latvia.
Thank you, moderator.
I would like to give comments on the Polish Open Dialogue Foundation statement. There's an impression that Kazakhstan is the worst country in the world with the poorest human rights records. Please don't go to Kazakhstan, journalists. You either will be ill-treated or jailed there. And this is in the country which has successfully hosted the OSCE summit after 11 years of break and almost 10 years of thereafter. Actually, I would want to reply to Open Dialogue Foundation if it was a true organization which really expresses aspirations of the Kazakh society, but it does not do that, because it is the foundation which is paid by the fugitive banker who has embezzled $8 billion and fled away and is convicted by the courts of UK and France. And the president of the foundation has been prohibited to be granted visa to Schengen area. And there's an investigation being carried out upon the true activity of the foundation.
Thank you.
Where is, one more moment.
Oh, sir.
Where is the Mr. Sitnikov who came here, rushed in, dropped a statement at us hastily and disappeared? It's just business. He was paid off, dropped the statement, and the job is done. Thank you.
Thank you. Latvia to be followed by Belarus.
Thank you, moderator. In reply to the Russian Federation about mass statelessness in Latvia mentioned in the opening session, non-citizens in Latvia are not in no way stateless in the meaning of the Convention of the Statelessness of 1954. The percentage of non-citizens has dropped under 11%. About glorification of Nazism in Latvia, let me remind that during and after the World War II, Latvia greatly suffered under occupation and two totalitarian regimes, the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany. Latvian authorities have constantly condemned all crimes against humanity committed by both totalitarian regimes. About mentioning in this session about Balt News, the domain name Balt News LV has a commercial project whose owner was a legal entity targeted by the EU sanctions, and we refer to the EU sanctions that were imposed to the EU following Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. About episode mentioned with Sputnik editor in Latvia, there is no confirmation by our law enforcement agencies about detention of Sputnik editor in Latvia in July of 2018. Thank you.
Belarus followed by the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Considering that my country was mentioned in the statement of Sweden on behalf of the European Union, I would like to make the following clarification. Belarus fully respects the citizens' right to obtain information. Regarding blocking of sites, yes, this is possible under our laws on the media, and the decision to limit access to websites is made in order to protect the citizens linked to the propaganda of using drugs, psychotropics, and other toxic materials, extremism, the propaganda of suicide, instigation to war, etc. Under this law, restricting access to information is only applied to sites where the Ministry of Information has given warnings to the owners of internet publications, which had to be done in writing over the course of a year. I won't go through all of the requirements under this law. I just wanted to say that anyone may appeal this decision in a court of law, and if the ministry, and if the name is cleared, then the access to information is restored.
Followed by Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Regarding the comment made by Sweden on behalf of the EU, the Russian sovereign internet law is intended to ensure unimpeded access to the internet, to ensure that outside meddling cannot cut us off from the internet. Of course, we're all aware that it's impossible to live without the internet at present. We don't want to isolate the internet either. It's not possible. And in fact, many of those using Russian language resources outside the Russian Federation, they're often in Western Europe. So we don't want to reduce the number of those using the Russian language internet.
Dear colleagues, whatever efforts Russia and its proxies undertake to get us to the parallel reality, all of us know that in real world of international law and the OSCE principles and commitments, Crimea and Sevastopol are Ukraine, temporarily occupied by Russia. We feel misery for the Russian delegation that uses controlled representatives of the national minorities and state-owned media to give us so-called truth. We will guide Crimean occupation propagandists who call themselves journalists to read RFOM statements of 2014 when Dunya Mijatovic, an independent journalist, were blocked in cellar in Simferopol by paramilitaries controlled by Russia's so-called Crimean self-defense. We also would like to remind you that you are working in Crimea on stolen Ukrainian equipment and frequencies. We also, and it was this truth, and it was confirmed by the representative of a real Crimean civil society. As for the statements of Ukrainian journalists who were allegedly wrongly convicted for some activities, there is opportunity to challenge the validity of certain decisions in court, demand that perpetrators to be held accountable, and demand compensation or non-pecuniary damage. Thank you.
UK to be followed by Finland.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The United Kingdom is a strong supporter of freedom of expression and freedom of the media. As has been highlighted already, at the end of last year, the former Foreign Secretary launched a global campaign to defend media freedom. In response to specific points raised today, decisions on broadcast regulation are a matter for Ofcom, the UK's independent regulator. As an independent body, Ofcom make their decisions without interference. In July, Ofcom fined news channel RT £200,000 for serious failures to comply with broadcasting rules and required the channel to broadcast a summary of Ofcom's findings to its viewers. This concerned failure to preserve due impartiality in 7 news and current affairs programmes between the 17th of March and the 26th of April 2018. In relation to the July conference on media freedom, 12 Russian journalists from 6 different outlets were accredited to the conference. The UK remains fully committed to media freedom and freedom of expression and opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Finland to be followed by Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I pass the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Thank you. In reply to some remarks made by some participants in this working session, I would like to reiterate our well-known position on the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea in the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. We did not, do not, and will not recognize it. We also regret the attempts by some participants of this meeting to use a legitimate opportunity for discussion and dialogue to make points relating to a situation that is in contradiction with Helsinki principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Austria to be followed by Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to react to a statement made by Open Dialogue Foundation earlier in this session. Every visa application is being thoroughly and carefully reviewed by Austrian diplomatic representations based on the applicable law. As I do not have any further details on the cases raised, I cannot speak on them today, but I offer bilateral follow-up to the representative of ODF if he so wishes. Thank you.
Thank you. Uzbekistan to be followed by Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, friends, I just wanted to say that Uzbekistan for the past 3 years has been pushing forward with openness, creating the environment for the freedom of the media and for the freedom of expression. We heard a statement today in that supposedly was said in Uzbekistan there is a list of sites that are contrary to our laws or traditions. We do not have such a list. Under the law, we have a decision of the court which pertains to materials which are extremist in nature, and it may have websites on there which are breaking the law. What's more, in our country, we have a law on the protection of children to protect children from information that may be dangerous to their health. under this law, we have to label information products based on information commissions that are fully authorized to recommend certain films or not, which are based on scenes of violence, etc. Thank you.
By Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Let me respond to the question raised by freelance journalist Mr. Karimov concerning the investigation process of journalist Afgan Mukhtarli. Georgian authorities consider effective investigation of this case of high importance, since it casts an unjustified doubt on Georgia as a democratic nation based on rule of law and democratic values. The investigation was launched under Article of Illegal Imprisonment of the Criminal Code of Georgia. To guarantee the impartial investigations, the head of Border Police and the chief of counterintelligence agency have been dismissed until the end of the investigation. 376 persons were interviewed. CCTV footages from 15 different locations were seized and examined. Mukhtarli's defense lawyer is provided with full access to the case files, including the CCTV footages. The evidence obtained at this stage of investigation is not sufficient to establish the factual circumstances surrounding the alleged crime and eventually to identify those responsible. However, investigation is still underway, and in case of obtaining additional evidence in the case, the relevant steps will be taken by the Prosecutor's Office of Georgia. Georgia is ready to share its results once the process is finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Azerbaijan to be followed by Turkmenistan.
Thank you very much. We're open to continue a dialogue with civil society that can be helpful on development of in solving issues concerning both sides. It is in our interest. Anyone, regardless of his position and social status, or anyone who violates laws, journalism ethics, and norms, who has committed an illegal act under the guise of representative of the media, should be responsible for this. Profession is not guaranteed to act illegally. About the online resources, I've made a statement before. I'm not going to repeat. Intolerance is demonstrated against journalists in developed Western countries too. Their activities are limited, they are detained, and the right of people to express their opinions freely is suppressed by the most stringent methods. However, unfortunately, such cases do not attract attention of both international media organization and the delegation of USA. Taking into account all of this, I think few should be more balanced and objective in their position and do not show a biased approach towards Azerbaijan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The last speaker, Turkmenistan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In light of the statement made by the representative speaking to the freedom of the media in Turkmenistan, on behalf of the delegation, I would like to say the following. The statement according to which there is apparently no independent media in Turkmenistan, that the internet's restricted, that journalists are being persecuted, well, that's simply not the case. We have independent news agencies, internet portals such as Arzuf, Turkmenportal, to name but a few. The citizens of Turkmenistan have their accounts, they have their various channels on various social media platforms, and they use those unhindered. Information about our president was disseminated by several outlets. This was fake news. Also, the information that was disseminated regarding the arrests, that is also untrue.
So, apologize to the interpreters and others for taking too long in this session, taking your attention. I would like to thank Ami Brulet for excellent introduction into the session. And in the end, I have some good news, maybe the first time good news tonight. We are having a reception at 6:30, and the organizers provide 3 buses for the participants to take them to Villa Foxal. And the buses are conveniently located at Gate 1. We have 3 more sessions on freedom of the media, so that's it for now, and see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.